Ladies and gentlemen, today is March 24th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, and the conversation in the chat will be happening as we go about world discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Good evening, sire.
Hey.
Yo.
What's up?
Well, I was thinking about doing a segment, so I texted you. I was like, yo, do you want to do a segment? And you were like, sure. And then I needed to be late because I was so busy kicking butt in Dota. 3-0 today.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, my breakthrough recently has been really thinking about taking the draft phase seriously. Because Dota has a lot of really hard counters in it. And if you pick a hero that has counters against it in the game, you're going to suffer a lot.
Yeah.
So being able to respect that, and instead of just being like, I'm working on this hero today, I want to be able to say I'm working on this ranged hero and this melee hero, so I can flex to one or the other depending on what my team needs, rather than forcing the issue.
See, don't you have to be good at pretty much all of the heroes for that to work, though?
Not really. As long as you know how to play a couple of each type, because there's flimsy high damage heroes and then there's tanky heroes. Okay. So if I want to play a carry and I can play some tanky heroes and some ranged DPS heroes, then I can just pick whichever type that I want. There are usually maybe 6 different tanky options that I could have. I don't know how to play all of those well, but if I can play at least 1 or 2 of them, then that's something in my repertoire where I can play a good drafted hero instead of basically just forcing the hero that I want to play that match.
Mm-hmm.
So that was good. Oh, BattleNet has to update. We're restarting StarCraft. And then on Friday, I went to a rave here in California. That was cool. Did you catch what I was saying about the preachers along the way?
I think I caught the tail end of it.
Okay, so I want to have it for the recording anyway. We met 2 Christians as everyone is walking into the festival, and they're walking from the main parking lot over to the festival. So there were 90,000 people who attended, and probably maybe at least 60,000 were in that lot or that area of lots. So around 60,000 of foot traffic walks by these people, which means they have a lot of words to deal out over that course of time. That's more than I probably stream to during a week. That's a shitload of people walking by. The first Christian guy was pretty positive, just general pro-Jesus of Jesus is the way, this is my flag for Jesus. It was white and had a cross that had purple accents on it and stuff. Pretty cool symbol. I hadn't really seen it before, so I don't know if it's referring to a particular denomination of Christian, but he's pretty nice, reading from the Bible, telling people Jesus was the way. But then randomly, he had bamboo armor on. Far East jungle bamboo armor, which, okay, well, why that? That's kind of random. That doesn't really remind me of Jesus and the imagery of him, but fair point. It is a rave. Other people are dressed up as random stuff, so I don't know if this is a rave person who maybe they're going to attend later and they just wanted to preach for a bit. But that's the first person we pass, and I've got no issue with them. That's cool. Pursue God. And then the second one is an older guy, and he's going full judgy neighbor dad at a PTA meeting, and he's like, you're going down the wrong path of the sex workers when you're showing your ass that much, and all this about the ravers who, a lot of them are honestly sharing or showing a lot of their butt, maybe most of it. But really raising the question of, is this ethically wrong to do so in an event that is 18 plus, right? So it is adults, and you're in the desert of California, so nobody else is fucking there. You should be allowed to more or less express yourself. And this individual was really taking a stand and saying that to them, that is morally very wrong. So,
duly noted, sir.
Yeah, we yelled back at this guy. Actually, a lot of people did. Trisha was cheering for the other side. and encouraging people to dress up as they wanted to. So he met with resistance, and there was a mini debate as we were going by. But we didn't really stop to debate him because we wanted to get the festival more than we wanted to argue with this random person. We weighed the pros and cons, and we're like, let's just continue.
Yeah. Understandably so. That's the move.
But yeah, really interesting ethics thoughts that we had on the way to the festival. The shows were all good. It was a very crowded event because there were so many people. The music was good, a lot of variety and the types of artists and stuff, and everything was all themed sort of Alice in Wonderland kind of look. They did a really good job with the environments. Yeah, it feels kind of like a little mini Disneyland or whatever because they have so many different lights and features that make it look like you're in a forest there. So really immersive and cool. And so many people are on so many drugs. So you have to kind of figure out how to navigate that space. As a PSA, just if we can start the broadcast with a life lesson. If you're going to take some kind of drug or substance, you should know what it is, what it does, and what doses can hurt you before you say yes to anything. And also, it's probably illegal, just as a side note, so keep that in mind. But yeah, a lot of people will take stuff that honestly just doesn't fit their body weight. You could take too high of a dose, which means you're going to be pretty much losing your combat readiness, kind of like foaming at the mouth and flopping on the ground. That's not really the state you want to be in, because if anything were to come up, you would be pretty stuck in a not active state of being. So do your research ahead of time, and then super stay hydrated as much as you can, because a lot of the stuff that they will offer to you, and if you were to take it, it will dehydrate you because it activates your fight or flight quite a bit. So expect to be dried up and dehydrated from the stuff if you were to imbibe any of it. Be hydrated, and then also be mindful of how much energy your body is using. If there's anything that like numbs pain for you, you're going to be disregarding the pain that you're incurring on your body during that period. So if you're like dancing very actively, jumping around, spending a lot of calories and energy, or like stomping and just like jumping and stuff, expect to be very tired and hurt later on, and just factor that in if you have to go do anything the next day. Fortunately, it was good for us. No one had any issues within our friend group, but I did see one individual during one of the sets who was like, as I was saying, kind of like foaming at the mouth, flopping on the ground, kind of like a fish out of water kind of thing, unsure of their environment. And then when they were picking this guy up, he was like, eyes super wide open, looked like hella confused, sort of a deal. So he probably had some mixture of stuff that didn't really agree with his state of being.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah, so stay safe, people. Do your research, make informed choices. To be honest, it's, in my opinion, a bad place to experiment with any drugs because you don't have a safe and controlled environment. There's like a lot of steps you need to take to get to a comfortable spot. If you're in a massive crowd of people who are also like on drugs, you should be comfortable and safe and like have options of people to take care of you. That's another really big one, is if you're gonna alter your state in such a way that you can't respond to like urgent action, then you need to be with someone who can be your guardian during that time. You're effectively a child who needs help, or a very drunk person.
Well, you could always just deal with all that the way I do, which is to never leave the house.
That's fair.
Problem solved.
Yeah. Stay comfy.
Well, the most physical exertion I get is the weekly walk challenges you give me.
Let's go. That makes me your fitness coach. Technically, I am. You know what Kukio would say to that? Fuck yeah. He would be excited about it.
Yeah, you guys gave good advice.
Yep.
I guess the benefits were somewhat negated, though, when I ate the family-sized Indian meal I had afterwards.
Well, the thing is, if you're going to have a big meal, doing it right after doing exertion is the best. So you did that well. You get some credit.
some protein there.
Yep.
Yeah, it was really good. They didn't have chicken 65 on their menu, but we asked them and they actually did know how to make it. So
Nice.
sometimes you got to ask.
Hmm.
Yeah, chicken 65, some cauliflower stuff that I hadn't had before, which is pretty good.
Nice.
Some gulab jamun, which is like Indian donuts. Basically tastes like pancakes, but it's really good.
Hmm.
And oh yeah, with the chicken 65, naan bread and raita. That's the way to do it. I wanted to get dosa. That
Hmm.
was also not on the menu. But when they were asked, they said they didn't have it. So missed opportunity there, unfortunately. And I used to love dosa with chicken 65 back in the day. But so it goes. Beggars can't be choosers. And when you're living in a food desert like Oak Cliff, you're definitely a beggar.
Hmm. Doesn't Oak Cliff have good Mexican food though?
Oh yeah, but I mean it's all junk food, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, food deserts are technically more about the lack of availability of healthy food rather than just junk food. Like even in officially designated food deserts, you can still get food. It's you just can't like get nutritious food, shall we say?
Hmm.
So yeah, in Oak Cliff, you can get some A grade Tex-Mex. Got some places down here I've been going to a long time that I still go to, including the one where you got your free bug.
Hmm.
It's unfortunate you had that experience because that actually is one of the better ones. Yeah, the greasy, small time, family owned Tex Mex restaurants generally have the best Tex Mex in my experience. So if you can get past the bugs, very, very good. So yeah, good Tex Mex. And there's some other stuff. And I don't know if you remember the Bishop's Arts District, but they've had more restaurants open over the past couple years. So there's some options up there. It's a little bit of a drive, but it can be worth it. So yeah, you can get some good stuff. It's not going to be anything that's especially good for you.
So I asked chat a bit about stuff in the world and was reading headlines, and the headlines were just all just people yelling and posturing and doing normal silly stuff. There was the terrorist attack. That I think was the main thing.
Yeah, in Moscow.
Oh, it was in Moscow.
Yeah, yeah. It was let's see. It's been a while since we've had a big jihadi attack, which is most likely what this is.
Hmm.
We've been so focused on sort of the new violence that fate has rewarded us with some throwback 2010 style violence. Yeah, this was claimed by Islamic State. Actually, do you know the details about the attack?
No, someone told me how many people died, but that's all I knew.
Oh, okay. Well, it might be better to start with that then. So there's a theater in Moscow. I don't remember the name, but it's a pretty decent sized theater. I was surprised that a theater was that big. They're a lot smaller here in the U.S. I guess we're just uncultured. But yeah, there was a lot of people there watching a play, and then some gunmen broke in, started shooting, and I guess set it on fire. I don't know if that was just like a side effect of the shooting or if that was something they deliberately did, but it did end up burning.
Damn.
So probably most of the people who died were shot to death, but there were probably also some who burned to death as the building burned down as well.
Damn.
Yeah, it's the biggest terrorist attack in Russia since I want to say Beslan, 2004, probably. It's pretty decent sized one. Do you remember Beslan at all?
No, what's Buzlon?
Beslan is a town in southern Russia. I forget the oblast, however it's pronounced. That was the school siege. Maybe you remember that?
Mm,
Not ringing a bell?
no.
Okay. Yeah, there was a school there that some Chechen Islamists broke into, and they took everybody in the school hostage. It was like several hundred kids and staff, and there was a big standoff for several days because they brought they brought suicide bombers with them, whom all had a dead man's switch, I think is what it was. Like if you, it's not that it explodes when you push the button; it's that it explodes when you take your hand off the button.
Mm-hmm.
So that's trickier to deal with from a counter-terrorist perspective for obvious reasons. So what they did is they put all the kids and staff in the gym, if I remember correctly, and then they had the suicide bombers in there with them. Mm-hmm. So very challenging situation for Russian security forces. And the end result is that things basically just went wrong, and I think over 100 children ended up getting killed. Damn. It was a rough one. It was pretty traumatic.
Damn.
That's definitely ingrained in the cultural memory of Russia. So that was Beslan, and there's been terrorist attacks since then in Russia, but none of them have reached like anywhere near the scale of Beslan, as far as I remember, until now, anyway. So yeah, it's a big one. Islamic State claimed it. The Russian government apparently disagrees. The Russian government is making noises to the effect that it was actually the Ukrainians who were behind it. So whether they're saying Ukrainians themselves did it or whether they funded it or supported it somehow, that's not entirely clear. It's not surprising. I mean, of course, the Russian government at this point is going to try to find anything and everything that it can blame on Ukraine. They're going to make those connections regardless of how real they are.
Yeah, they want to villainize them for sure.
Yeah. It's especially stupid now, though, because in the days since the attack, the Islamic State actually released video that the attackers took while they were there. So that seems like pretty good proof that it was them. But yeah, the Russian government has never particularly cared much about proof in the grand scheme of things. They're going to do their thing regardless.
So when ISIS claimed the attack, why are they attacking them? Like, what's the purpose?
Well, I mean, the joke answer is it's ISIS, so, you know, they don't need a reason, really. That's just kind of their thing. Their calling card is basically ubiquitous violence, or should I say gratuitous violence, probably both, more accurate. If you want some specific examples of stuff, there's the fact that Russian advisors and mercenaries are fighting in West Africa against insurgents and rebels, some of whom are Islamist, and a few of whom are technically aligned with the Islamic State. Also, the Russians are in Syria assisting Bashar al-Assad's government, and that government, of course, is technically the enemy of the Islamic State. I don't know how much fighting al-Assad has done against Islamic State. They've probably been a lot more focused against the Turkish-backed rebels in the north of the country. But technically, they are on opposite sides. And the Russian government is also on pretty good terms with Iran, relatively speaking. They do give them some support and whatnot, and the Iranian government is on Islamic State's exceedingly long shit list. So that itself is another reason for them to attack them. Also, they're Christians and apostates and, takfirs, so that's pretty much the only reason they really need to commit an act of violence like this. Yeah, I don't think they have anything specific in mind that they're necessarily retaliating against, as far as I know. If somebody in chat knows better, let me know. But as far as I know, this is just the Islamic State doing Islamic State things. Yeah, I mean, Islamic State and, jihadi terrorism more broadly never really went away. They've just kind of been very busy with their own things in the region, specifically the Middle East. So they've kind of been out of the headlines for a while. Obviously they got the shit kicked out of them when they, after they expanded out into eastern Syria and western Iraq. Everybody was freaking out that, they're going to take over the region or whatever, but that was never, as we've discussed extensively, that was never going to happen. And their capabilities, so to speak, have been significantly degraded since then on account of the subsequent international effort to, kill them, which was fairly successful. But in the years since, they have, kind of maintained some presence. They were never completely removed from the region. And they've committed, intermittent acts of violence here and there, in this, that, and the other region since then, in the years since. Yeah, largely, most of the groups that are referred to as Islamic State are actually just local Islamist groups that previously act on their own initiative, but that later ended up aligning with the Islamic State in exchange for, basically resources and expertise. Islamic State kind of gave them the offer, kind of like Al Qaeda used to do in their heyday. They would give them the offer of sending like advisors and money in exchange for declaring nominal fealty towards their command structure. How much fealty there actually is pretty debatable. By and large, these are basically just the same organizations they've always been, but technically they are a part of a broader Islamist movement, technically, nominally led by the Islamic State. So in this case, in the Moscow attack, it was not ISIS per se, it was actually Islamic State Khorasan, and or Khorasan, maybe I'm mispronouncing it, but that's the branch of the Islamic State in Central Asia. Khorasan is like the traditional Islamic name for Central Asia, apparently. And so that's the group that committed the attack. They've generally been pretty focused on Afghanistan. They actually fight quite a bit with the Taliban. That's sort of been their main focus, but they have branched out occasionally to attack, I think, in Pakistan and Iran, and I guess now Russia. Actually, I don't know that we ever talked about Iran, did we?
Don't think so.
Okay, we might get in. Well, I mean, I can just talk about it now, I guess. You remember Omar Soleimani, like the Iranian general that Trump killed?
Yep.
So there was a memorial for him recently. Well, I shouldn't say recently, it was several months ago. But there was a memorial for him, and there was a bunch of people there, and a suicide bomber hit it and killed something like 80 to 90 people.
Damn.
And, Islamic State took credit for it as one of their operations. They obviously do not like the Iranian government. They think of them as enemies as well as, apostates. Everybody and their mother is an apostate according to the Islamic State. So it's no surprise. But
Yeah.
if you know anything about the Sunni-Shia split, there's particular rancor there. So, that's an example of an Islamic State operation in Iran. They hit Soleimani's memorial there a couple months ago.
Damn.
So I should say that's ISIS-K. That's Islamic State Khorasan specifically. So they've been fairly active over the past couple, let's say year or so. There's also stuff going on in Africa. Technically Al-Shabaab is affiliated with Islamic State, I think, or at least there's some groups in Somalia that are. And there's some rebel groups in West Africa, like I said, in the Sahel, that are kind of coordinating with them, allegedly. So, they're around, but they just haven't been able to get anywhere near as high profile as they did back in 2014 when they blew into Iraq. People cared a lot more about Iraq in 2014 than people now care about, say, West Africa or Somalia. Those are not bottlenecks in the global economy like, say, Iraq is, given its oil production. So they just haven't gotten the same degree of attention, but they're still active, as the Russians have recently found out. It's not going to change anything. The main takeaway here is not that there's going to be some significant pivot, away from the war in Ukraine. The Russians are obviously going to continue to prosecute that. And I imagine that they do have some counterterrorism forces that will be sent to try to retaliate to some degree against ISIS, but I don't think it'll be their main focus. And I don't think it's going to change anything for anybody else either, like the United States, Europe, China. I think terrorist attacks are just kind of a thing that happens at this point. It's not like some dire threat. I think one of the mistakes that was made in the war on terror here in the United States in the years after 9/11 was that terrorism was treated as a major national security threat, which was unrealistic in the grand scheme of things. It would have been much better to keep priorities focused in foreign policy on significant strategic interests rather than these sort of tactical pinpricks. Certainly it's tragic when people die because of terrorism of one kind or another, but there's a relatively limited amount of stuff that you can tangibly do about it. You can mitigate it, certainly. Counterterrorism does have an effect, but sort of these broader visions of trying to dedicate the entirety of national security, the national security apparatus, to counterterrorism was always a bit ridiculous. And results speak for themselves. Like, it didn't really work that well in the grand scheme of things. So, we still do counterterrorism. That never went away. But now emphasis in national security is much more on traditional concerns, such as great power conflict, however you want to define that. So most likely, the focus is not going to shift away from the great power competition between, say, the United States and Russia, the United States and China, etc. Terrorist attacks, even large ones like this, are not going to change that. There might still be cooperation. I think the United States State Department actually released a warning saying that Americans in Russia, what few there may be at this point, should stay away from public places in the near future. That was about a month ago, and they were explicitly warning about a terrorist attack that the U.S. government had intelligence on. And I would imagine that they probably shared that intelligence with the Russian government, even in spite of current tensions. Counterterrorism cooperation has been one of those things that both countries have in common. It's a common interest to try to contain the threat from jihadist groups like Islamic State.
Yeah, common ground. Like, I dislike terrorism happening to my people. You dislike terrorism happening to your people. Let's turn terrorism aside.
Yeah. I mean, it has been a bright spot. Again, it's all relative, but relatively speaking, that has been a bright spot. That's something that they've continued to do. I don't know that it's as close as it used to be. There may be some more distance there, but I expect that given the sensitivity of the intelligence, the United States didn't have any particular reason not to give it to Russia. Well, maybe sensitivity is not the right word, but given that there was an imminent large-scale attack, I imagine it would have only benefited relations to share it. It certainly didn't hurt the war effort in Ukraine at all, so, why not? But as was, nothing happened in, the 2 or 3 weeks after that warning was issued. So I don't know if the Russians didn't take it seriously, or maybe there just wasn't anything they could do. But regardless, the attack still ended up happening. And it seems like, I could be wrong. Maybe the attack that happened in Moscow was a different attack than the one the U.S. government got word of. But I expect it was probably the same one. That's kind of my assumption.
Unfortunate that there's innocent life being lost in any case of who did it or why. Dude, heckin' hitting concert goers is not cool. Same thing with October 6th. It's just like concert people.
Yeah, that's actually what I thought of. Because a lot of those people are probably, theater kids. Either theater kids or adult theater kids, one or the other. Mm-hmm. So they're probably not like super ultra-nationalist, ethno-nationalist Russians, right? They're probably relatively mild peaceniks, I would imagine. And they really got the short end of the stick again. Mm-hmm. Just like you say, just like in October in Israel.
Yep. Just leave the music people alone. Give war to the war people, give music to the music people. I've spoken.
There you go.
Yeah.
How's that for a campaign platform?
Yeah. Well, the thing is,
for those who want it, music for others.
Yeah, war done well is between other warriors. Bring the civilians into this. They're just trying to go to a show. Give them some peace. So, yep. There was that. A bunch of headlines of Trump with his bonds. They're like, he's Don Corleone or something like that. Trying to be funny.
Yeah, there was a big fine. He wanted to, what was it? He wanted to get a bond, but he couldn't. And then, it came out that he was going to raise like a shit ton of money by selling shares in Truth Social,
Uh-huh.
which was the social media platform that he set up. So he's going to be able to pay the fine, which is pretty much what I assumed would happen, which is why I wasn't really following the story
Gotcha.
too closely. He's pretty good at getting money.
Mm-hmm.
I still don't think he's a particularly good businessman in the grand scheme of things. Like, he's not an innovator per se. But if you've got billions of dollars, like, you can get money if you need it. That's eminently doable. I'm not sure why people would pay billions of dollars for shares in Truth Social. That's kind of a different question. I think some of his investor buddies who are trying to support him politically might be more behind that. Because I don't see it as like a growth prospect, right? That doesn't seem like growth stock. I don't think Truth Social is going to be the next big thing. Oh, and there was also some talk about the RNC diverting funds towards Trump's legal fees, which had a lot of people chortling. They're not diverting all of it, it's just some of it. So it's not like they're going to just completely starve down ballot races of support from the RNC. It's not as dramatic as people on Reddit were making it out to be. Yeah, there's always news about Trump, but it's generally pretty bland stuff. I haven't seen anything especially dramatic about him. Did you see the stuff about a couple states trying to remove him from the ballot?
Yeah. I did see some of that. I don't know if they can legally do that, but...
Well, that was the question, and it ended up before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically said that states could not do that. Their ruling was a little more nuanced than that. Basically, though, they kind of punted on it, as they frequently do. I did read one analysis that said they were kind of scared about basically conceding. Well, what they were scared of was ruling on whether or not Trump had actually tried to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. That was something that they stayed away from. And that's something that a lot of observers were looking for. Like, did he actually do it or not? And the Supreme Court kind of toed around that. If the Supreme Court rules that somebody is not allowed, a major candidate that has widespread support cannot be on the presidential ballot, well, on the ballot, I should say, that would be very, very controversial. And a lot of guys on the Supreme Court are, consummate professionals, probably more so than the public is willing to concede. But they're also institutionalists. Like, they're aware that there are things that they should forbear on in order to avoid significant backlash from the public. So there are times, Roberts in particular, Justice Roberts, is known for being of that mind. It's not just the law that he thinks of when he, weighs factors in his rulings. He also tries to keep in mind the independence of the judicial branch as an institution, because it's going to be less independent if partisan hacks kind of turn on it and try to politicize it, and that's not going to be good for the court or probably for the justice system writ large in the United States. But yeah, largely on this ruling, they kind of punted and they just said, well, I mean, states can't really decide that, and the law they're citing doesn't really apply here, so he's going to be on the ballot correspondingly.
Gotcha.
So that's a kind of sort of settled issue. The ruling allows room for future candidates to potentially be removed from the ballot depending on the context. But 2024 is the one people are focused on, and so as far as that election goes, Trump will be on the ballot in Colorado and also Maine, as well as any other states that were trying to do this.
Also, the states that were trying to do that are probably less likely to vote for him anyway, so it's not a huge loss.
Yeah, for the most part. But, it's the principle of the thing, right? Because if they can do it, then other states of a different mind can do it later on to candidates that they don't like. And even if, well, more to the point, let's say that there is a state that is not necessarily a lock for one or the other party. What happens if a governor or legislature in one of those states tries to remove somebody from the ballot? So it's a sensitive issue. You can't really blame the Supreme Court for being careful about it. It's not something that you want to kind of just casually throw out a ruling on. You kind of want to consider all of the consequences there, which is what they're supposed to do. That's a part of the job. But especially for something like this in an election year, that's especially sensitive.
Yeah, they're not really handed the easiest situation to officiate on.
Yeah.
It's pretty weird too because of how many like rabid fans he has.
Oh yeah.
That in a sense he has some level of safety in the sense of the stricter you are on him, the more you upset them.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the things that really boosted his numbers, right? Because when they first started, he's had court cases against him pretty much continuously since he left office, so no surprise. But there's been a whole bunch more that have been filed in the past year, in particular, and the timing has a lot of people suspicious. And a lot of that seemed sufficiently suspicious to his supporters that they think that he's being targeted by his political rivals. I think that's half true. I think really he probably is just a criminal who bends the law on the regular. He kind of has a history of that, so it's not that surprising. But at the same time, I think there's probably some truth to the idea that a lot of these cases were probably timed to coincide with the election, roughly speaking. And whether that was something that the Democratic Party as a whole tried to coordinate, which I doubt, because there's not really a Democratic Party as a whole to coordinate it, or if it was just individual DAs doing that so that they could have something to run on, or so that they could give something to run on for their allies, which seems more likely to me. But which of those two is the case is a little hard to determine. I think it's the latter more than the former, but good luck proving it. Nobody's going to be completely honest about stuff like that. So that was enough to really boost his numbers when the primary started, and kind of helped push him ahead of some of his leading rivals, like DeSantis, for example. Obviously, there were other factors hurting DeSantis, like the fact that he's DeSantis. His lack of charisma at this point is kind of a running gag. So that probably was the more important factor, but certainly all of the convictions and the narrative that he's being targeted by political rivals, that also had a rallying effect on his supporters and conservatives generally.
Yeah, I haven't really watched enough of DeSantis to know why people don't like him, but he definitely had, it seemed like a brief moment where he was getting a lot of attention, and then his stonks kind of fell off.
Well, the problem is that when he was in Florida as governor, he was basically just on the Trump train, just kind of parroting a lot of the stuff that Trump was talking about and latching on to populist movements, populist narratives. He didn't really have to do much. But when he started actually campaigning for the presidency, then he had to come out and actually present a full campaign platform. And he had to actually kind of go and meet and greet with people. He had to schmooze. He had to actually beg for money, from the donor class. He had to do all the politician type stuff that you have to do to run for the presidency. And, from all the accounts I've read, when he tried to do that stuff, he was not very good at it. The one that stuck out to me was a meeting he went to in Europe, in which he and his team were set to talk with, some representatives of some of the more important European governments, in order to kind of, exchange ideas, talk to each other, see what they wanted, see what they were going to do in the future, et cetera. If you're a European government, it behooves you to kind of have an idea of who the leading presidential contenders are in the United States, so you can start to get an idea of what you're going to be dealing with later, even if most of the people you talk to are obviously not going to end up winning. And, the article I read about it suggested that DeSantis was extremely passive during that whole meeting. The whole conference was basically a waste of time because there was very little information exchanged. He didn't really put anything forward. It seemed like he was just kind of there for the sake of being there. And that was the kind of vibe he apparently had in a lot of meetings like that. And you need to be more proactive than that. You really need to kind of engage with people and show them that you're serious about the job, the job of running for president and eventually being president. And if you can't do that, if you can't like express a vision, if you can't convince people, if you can't offer something compelling to convince people that you're serious and that you know what you're doing, people are going to turn on you. There's always going to be a more charismatic candidate that you can turn to, and generally those guys mop the floor with the less charismatic guys. George W. Bush back in the day, for whatever else you can say about the guy, the compassionate conservative thing was a winner for a long time. That was how he won in 2000. And, in 2004, he was more focused on terror, terror, 9/11, 9/11, God bless America, that whole spiel for basically 6 years or so of his presidency. But compassionate conservatism was still a part of the plank. And he did a pretty good job of schmoozing with people, getting the donor class on board. He did good with the meet and greets, with the citizenry, like all the little stuff that you don't think too much about as a casual observer, but which is actually pretty important to the overall process. He was good at that. He made that work. Didn't do him any favors in the long run. By the time his second term was over, he was one of the more hated presidents in recent American history. But as far as winning goes, you can't knock him. Like he was a 2-term president. DeSantis doesn't have that touch. He's just not very good at it.
Yeah, I feel like some of it involves not just having a strong base, but also being able to charm the fence sitters in a way that they feel like, okay, this seems like a genuine person who talks like people I know. You need to be relatable in some context. But I feel like because DeSantis kind of established himself as a Trump ally early on, but he doesn't really have that same attention grabby personality. He has, I think, the wrong personality for the type of platform and policies he would want to be holding.
Yeah, I think in Florida, it's easier for him to win, just because his politics kind of already align with the politics there. But when you run for president, you're dealing with a much, much bigger electorate, and you've got to make adjustments correspondingly. And if you're not able to reach out and appeal to a broader base beyond the one you're used to appealing to, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so that's what really plagued DeSantis, and as well as a lot of the other guys that were running against Trump. But DeSantis in particular seemed unable to leverage his initial lead into any broader support. So Trump mopped the floor with him, no surprise. Trump, whatever else you can say about him, is extremely charismatic. He's definitely got a very strong vibe that attracts people of like mind.
Yep.
And I think a lot of traditional politicians, which includes Ron DeSantis, find it very difficult to replicate that. If you're an establishment politician, then your politics has always been pretty bland. You're trying to be the responsible stakeholder politician rather than the rah-rah, burn it all down politician. Trump is more the latter. And if you've spent your whole career being the former, you can't really transition, right? If you're an establishment candidate for like 20 years and then suddenly you start talking about burning everything down, people aren't going to believe you. They're just going to think you're bandwagoning, which is exactly what you would be doing, most likely. So it's just not really credible. And that's sort of the problem a lot of more centrist politicians have right now in the United States. Like a lot of the centrist politicians we have right now are sort of older guys who've been around a while, and they can't really shift their politics credibly in a way that people really find believable. And so that's opened the door, given how much mistrust there are in centrist politicians right now in the United States, that's opened the door for more radical actors like, Donald Trump, as well as equivalent actors on the political left. Presumably that opens the door for a newer generation of more moderate politicians to kind of move in, who have more credibility. They can adapt to the more popular aspects of populist politics as they are right now, while balancing them out with some more moderate traditional policies. That's probably the future of centrist politics in the United States.
Who are the populists on the left? Do we have them?
Do we have them? Yeah, they're not very powerful. Nobody like Donald Trump, for example, who managed to win the presidency. But House reps like AOC, I forget her full name, or Ocasio. What is it? Chat, help me out. What is AOC's actual name? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There we go. You've probably seen some of her quotes on Reddit at some point. But she's one example. Kind of, sort of Elizabeth Warren. She kind of had a consumerist left-wing vibe for a while, as far as her campaign platform. But she kind of flits between traditional establishment politics and more radical politics, depending on what's more convenient. Basically, depending on whether or not she's running for president. You know, she was less, I think, radical when she was just a senator. Wait, was she a senator? Am I mixing people up again?
Who?
Well, she was
Elizabeth Warren?
Yeah, Elizabeth Warren.
I think she was. That sounds right.
Okay. But when she ran for president, you know, she kind of had to appeal to more to the left, so she shifted a bit.
Massachusetts senator, I think. Yeah, senator since 2013.
There you go.
I guess she is a senator currently.
Yeah, Massachusetts
Was or is?
is serving since 2013.
The Native American senator. Oh my gosh, I remember that.
Yeah, there was that whole
Slightly Native American, but not in a way that anyone would put her in that category.
Everybody's got to hustle, especially in the United States.
You'd argue Warren went more centrist during her presidential run. I feel like Bernie Sanders kind of cornered the yelling Democrat market pretty well. He had a very recognizable yell, and he had like the old angry grandpa that's got a few good points kind of vibe to him, so a lot of people really liked him. He seemed like a person who you can imagine on your street corner kind of yelling about what the American people need, and you kind of like nod and smile like, yeah, he's actually right about that. So I feel like Warren, she wasn't going to beat him at that game because that's not her style at all.
Yeah.
So for her to go more centrist makes a lot of sense. She seems more establishment just with how she talks and acts. A lot more diplomatic.
Well, what somebody in chat said, it was the other way around. She started more radical, and what was it? I think they were correcting me. I would trust chat more because I didn't follow her run very closely. But Bernie Sanders is probably the penultimate example of left-wing populism.
True, yeah.
So yeah, there's a couple out there. They exist. And progressive politics in particular, especially over the past 5 to 10 years, has gotten very, very populist.
I'm just thinking of like a fun quick tip for getting out of legal trouble, and how a big way that you can mitigate being convicted of stuff as an individual citizen of the US is just run for office of president and get all those different
immunities.
Yeah, different things entangled with you, so you're temporarily immune. And just keep running for president as well, just so you keep that shield active. It does take up some time. You do have to campaign and talk to a lot of people, but you can get out of trouble for a while. So.
Oh yeah, that's basically what Netanyahu has been doing in Israel.
Oh really?
Yeah, we talked about it before. It's been a while, but yeah, he's got the corruption charges against him that have been outstanding for some time. But if he's prime minister, he's immune, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, he's kind of busy, right?
Yeah.
I know you think I'm corrupt and being corrupt is bad, but I'm in a very good place of power right now, and I need to make sure I manage that well.
Yeah.
So I'd appreciate if you don't prosecute me until later.
So he's been hanging on to power like grim death, correspondingly. I'm sure part of it also is just his ego. He probably genuinely thinks that he's the shit and that Israel couldn't survive without him. But, the immunity to the corruption charges is also a factor there.
Yeah, and he's relatively hawkish for how he talks.
Oh, yeah.
He's obviously put into a difficult role if there's been conflict there since before he was around. So the conflict isn't really of his making, but the stance that he takes is a lot more of a hawkish one than a dovish one, which I think that's one of the points that Western people who get served a lot of social media on Israel-Palestine need to keep in mind is they have an aggressive leader right now, relatively speaking, who has a lot of like military background and stuff, and he's got a bunch of shit involved with him. So remember not to direct your anger at Israeli citizens in general, because they didn't make all these decisions. They're usually just normal people, most of them. But leaders like this, I feel like, are the ones that are making these like big military choices, or just the stances for how you talk to people versus get violent.
Yeah. Yeah, I would repeat the advice I gave in a previous segment, which is that most of the stuff critics of Israel complain about with regard to Israel are things that are pretty specific to Likud, generally. Mm-hmm. So if you want to complain about Israel, focus your complaints more at Likud than Israel, and you'll be on much stronger ground.
And then same thing with Palestine, where there have been a lot of innocent Israelis killed, but it's not all Palestinian people who are involved in this. There is a organization called Hamas that is managing most of these things. And that's not the whole of the people. There are many normal people just trying to live normally, do their business, keep their shop, so on.
I would add the caveat here that most people in Israel agree with the hardline approach to the Palestinians, and most Palestinians agree that violent resistance against Israel is justified. So keep that in mind. Mm-hmm. It's not as though a peaceful solution is on the horizon here if we can just get the right quote-unquote people in charge. Pretty much everybody involved in the conflict is pretty belligerent at this point. But that said, I think it's important to contextualize some of the, to contextualize the conflict. The settlements in particular in the West Bank are a problem. And Likud has played a disproportionate role in propagating them. Mm-hmm. So I know the inevitable counter-argument is that the settlements are not the primary reason for the conflict. And to that I would say, I know, trust me, I know. I've been told many times. I've read it many times. I know the history. So yes, I get that. But keep in mind that is a particular thorn in the conflict, certainly for the Israeli side of the conflict. And it's one that I really wish they would take more seriously, because speaking as an American who would prefer to support them, the settlements make that almost impossible. It's extremely difficult. So if you guys could stop that, it would improve your strategic position like considerably. So, when people complain about the settlements, it's not just them shitting on Israel, either because they're ignorant or because they disproportionately side with the Palestinians. Even people who support Israel complain about the settlements. So deal with that, please. And everything else will be much easier.
Well, settlements are just straight up disrespecting people's property, right? They're just taking land that isn't technically theirs, and they're like, no, this is mine now, and just being stubborn.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that happens more at the local level. Occasionally, the national government will basically authenticate illegal land seizures like that. That actually happened just recently. The far right in Israel loves to embarrass the U.S. government, because the U.S. government insists, as a matter of policy, that the settlements are illegal internationally, according to international law. And so one of the things that the far right does in Israel is that whenever there's a major visit by an American politician, they'll try to go out of their way to authorize and authenticate these land seizures. So I think just recently, before Anthony Blinken went to Israel recently, they announced that they were going to officially, recognize and incorporate another branch of what it was home building in seized territory. So it was territory that was not officially part of Israel, that is an occupied territory. Its legality was ambiguous, but now they've de facto annexed it by authorizing a whole shit ton of, new home construction there. So that was basically a snub to the American government. And they've delighted in doing that just for like decades. That's not a new thing. And it's always very flustering for the U.S. government. But, given politics in the United States and how partisan it is, generally the American backlash is not that significant. But even if it works in the short term to kind of signal to, conservative allies in the United States that they're on the same team and that they're making the left-wing government look bad, even though they do it to right-wing governments too. It's a long-term detriment to Israel, because Israel really needs to be on good terms with both American parties. And right now it's definitely only on decent terms with one. And even that is questionable. There's no guarantee that's going to stay positive for the long term at this point. Anyway, that's a tangent.
World discussion with Agent Smith, where we do tangents better than most.
Yeah. To bring it full circle, we were talking about Trump and his legal troubles, and I made the Netanyahu comparison. So then we were off to the races. Israel is always a topic that kind of sucks you in. So no surprise. Well, not you specifically, but that sucks people in.
Yeah.
That always drags the conversation in wild directions. But yeah, I guess the meta here, as far as Trump, the meta game as far as news reporting on Trump and events relating to Trump, he's going to run for president. He's going to be on the ballot. All of these little scandals that pop up and are going to pop up between now and November are not going to stop him. They're not going to put a dent in his popularity. The election is basically a referendum on populism. Do you want a populist president or do you not want one? That's what it's going to be. And there's going to be drama between now and then. The polls are going to change. I don't doubt that Biden will lead sometimes, Trump will lead other times. But the election, as projected right now, is going to be extremely close. And probably, regardless of what happens, we're not going to have any idea who's going to win until Election Day. So barring some dramatic structural change in the politics surrounding the presidential election between now and the election, I would not bet on anything. It's totally up in the air right now. But I would also not bet on any particular scandal, again, tipping the election one way or the other. So that's basically just a distraction. I'm barely paying attention to it. I just don't think it's going to matter in the long run. And I expect most likely I'm going to be right. So if you see some, clickbaity title, if you see some headline saying, something's going to happen to Trump, most likely it's not going to matter. It's just going to be bullshit.
Well, the headlines have said that for like the past 5 years, so it's okay.
Oh yeah. Russiagate being the prime example. He's totally going to get impeached, guys. He's a Russian agent. Well, I said pretty much from the start that's not going to go anywhere, and hey, ended up being right. And that's pretty much been the pattern with almost every major scandal involving Trump. Not that I've been right about it, mind you, just that they've all not had a big impact on his popularity. So I don't expect that to change. Yeah, we're kind of stuck in a doom loop here. This is what happens when people lose trust in institutions and political parties and the establishment generally. They start turning to alternatives, and those alternatives may or may not be substantive. I guess it's kind of down to individual judgment about which alternatives are substantive and which are just self-interested fake bullshit. I've been pretty clear about where I stand on Trump in that regard. So, I'm not going to be your mother and tell you what to believe on that. That's for everybody to decide for themselves. But we are caught in that doom loop where there's a significant mistrust to the point where just any and every alternative is being seriously considered. And it's very hard to get out of that in the short term. It really does require trust to be rebuilt. Mm-hmm. And hopefully that's going to involve a populist alternative that actually does want to implement positive change. You just kind of have to trust the public on that. Not sure I'm liking where they're leaning right now, but we'll see.
We'll see what happens. Yeah.
Other countries have gone through this. Do you remember Silvio Berlusconi?
Sounds familiar. That's Italy.
Yeah, Italy. He was prime minister of Italy. He was the bunga bunga guy. He was like this big. He was a big media magnate, very wealthy. Started his own party. And actually, he used to be a part of another conservative party, but broke away. And yeah, he was just kind of a cad. He partied too much. Didn't really implement any significant reforms while in office. Like, he was just sort of there for the sake of being there. And there was all of these corruption allegations. He was in and out of court constantly. A lot of it was pretty substantive. And, basically the only reason they ever got him out of office, because as you can imagine, he was very popular. He was very charismatic. Being the sort of the party billionaire guy who wants to be, conservative party billionaire guy in particular, mind you, gave him a lot of pull and credibility amongst a lot of voters, especially in southern Italy. Southern Italy was sort of the stronghold for him as far as voting support went. And I think about the only thing that got him out of office was the scandal over the underage hooker, as I recall. Yeah, it was like a Moroccan girl, if I'm not mistaken. She'd lied about her age or something. She was actually like 15. And she was at a party, of course. Of course, Europeans have the best parties. European elites specifically have the best parties. It's always like hookers and porn stars and, gay orgies. It's crazy.
They go all out.
Oh, yeah. So, Berlusconi was that guy. So he had all these wild parties, the bunga bunga parties, as they were called. And, one of the girls at them ended up being underage, and they kind of nailed him on it. And, his popularity was already slipping. I think that was around the time of the Eurozone crisis, so Italy's economy was struggling. So there was definitely other factors involved, but that was one of the final nails in his coffin. He actually lingered on for a while after that. His party still continued to have a presence in parliament, and, he kind of wheeled and dealed a bit. There was talk for a while, a year or two ago, that he might actually run for prime minister again, which had a lot of people rolling their eyes, but he ended up dying, so problem solved. But yeah, once populists like that get into power, their charisma and popularity generally makes it very difficult to get them out. So these populist eras tend to drag on for significant periods of time correspondingly. And the first thing I thought when it looked like when Donald Trump might win in 2016 was that Silvio Berlusconi might be president of the United States. Because it's the same guy. They're the same person. And I remember when Berlusconi was in power in Italy and thinking, man, I'm glad that we don't have that here. And of course, fate cursed me with that. I jinxed it.
Oh, no.
I jinxed it. So we ended up with American-themed Berlusconi. Lots of other examples around the world, but Berlusconi was definitely the one that stood out. Oh, we were talking about Iran before. And so after that suicide bombing hit Soleimani's memorial, the Iranian government kind of freaked out a little bit. They started lashing out and launching airstrikes at groups that may or may not have been involved. It's not entirely clear. They were obviously pretty opaque about that. But they did go out and launch airstrikes in, for example, Kurdish Iraq. There was like this one guy who was a leading backer of one of the two main Kurdish parties in northern Iraq who had his house blown up. They targeted his house with, I think, like a cruise missile or something. And, I don't know if that guy had any connections at all, to the suicide bombing. I don't think of the Kurds as being like some major supporters of Islamic State. Certainly the two major political parties anyway. So, that might have just been the Iranian government flexing. It might have been unrelated to the bombing, but, given that it happened at the same time as a spat of other Iranian attacks, I kind of assumed that it was related, that it was sort of the Iranian government trying to retaliate and then just not really knowing who to go after, and so just going after everybody. So that was one. The other big one was they launched an airstrike on a Baluchi separatist group, which I think is also kind of a terrorist group. Kind of the line between them is pretty blurry. Now, the thing is that while Iran does have its own Baluchi separatists, the Baluchi separatist group that they attacked was one that was actually within Pakistan. So when they launched the airstrike, they actually ended up hitting Pakistani territory. And that was a big deal because it seems that they did not coordinate that with the Pakistani government. It seems they kind of just did it. So, violations of sovereignty like that are pretty serious. And it looked for a while that there might be a kerfuffle over that. Dare I say border violence, but they ended up just kind of talking it out. Although not before the Pakistanis retaliated in kind by launching an airstrike in Iranian territory, targeting Baluchi separatists / terrorists there. And then after that, it just kind of de-escalated. So it was a very weird sequence of events. The Iranian government unilaterally targeted terrorists in Pakistan, and then the Pakistanis retaliated by unilaterally targeting terrorists in Iran. And then they just kind of shrugged it off and went about their day. It's weird. Yeah, the best explanation I saw of it is that both governments had reasons to try to project strength, but neither one had any interest in actual conflict. So for Pakistan, it was an election year. Those elections have since concluded, but at the time, they were in the future. So it made sense then for the Pakistani government to kind of try to flex a bit and try to make sure that the voters didn't think they looked weak. And then, of course, for the Iranians, they were retaliating to the suicide bombing, so they had good incentive to try to attack somebody, in order to make it look like they were doing something about it.
Makes sense.
Yeah, but both Pakistan and Iran are dealing with their own issues, so neither one was actually interested in some kind of border flare-up. So, once both sides preserved their honor, then they just sort of let it be.
Yeah.
Yeah, violence is, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, a form of political expression.
Yep. To appease a group, sometimes they want you to get vengeance on another group to prove your loyalty and to actually have their interests at heart. Sometimes people do legit just want vengeance.
Not true. Unfortunately, when it's violent, that can cause cycles of violence that reverberate for a very long period of time.
Wouldn't it be so funny if they had like subtitles for when politicians talked that translated what they're trying to sell to you at that moment? They're like selling vengeance toward historically opponent groups, and it's like, ooh, tell me more. And they're like selling you some confirmation bias as well, and you're like, okay, this is looking really nice. Selling you affirmations of the values you already hold. Oh my goodness, where's the ballot box? I'm voting right now.
That's what people look for. That's why focus groups are a thing. You can test out messages and see what works, what doesn't. You can poll people. There's a variety of tools you can use to gauge what positions are going to be the most efficacious in a given run. The upshot is that that's a good way to build coalitions of different voting groups and blocks. The downside is that the results tend to be kind of stale and artificial. If you are going to do focus group politics, you're not going to sound or feel like a very authentic politician. You're going to sound like somebody who's just trying to win office, but who doesn't necessarily actually believe in anything. I don't know that Donald Trump believes in anything, but he's honest about it.
He believes in getting attention. I feel like he has some clear objectives.
Yeah, he kind of shared that with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had similar energy in that people kind of knew he was full of shit, but he didn't really hide it too much. And so that kind of appealed to a certain proportion of the going public. People don't necessarily agree with everything Trump says, but people who support him kind of just like what they're getting.
Yeah,
they
it's
know
the
what
kind of
they're
slicksta archetype where they're bullshitting some people, but they're kind of fancy while doing it and funny to watch. So a lot of people will be kind of supportive of it, even if they know it's someone who's not the most trustworthy and high integrity character, but they're making plays. And you kind of want your leader to make plays in some way.
Yeah, Donald Trump has that in spades. Bill Clinton less so, but enough to win the presidency twice. Unfortunately, it didn't rub off on his wife. Hillary Clinton was not known for being a charismatic politician.
Opposites attract, I guess, for their
I guess.
relationship.
Didn't work for her. Well, what else did we want to get to?
We talked some about elections and stuff, the terrorist thing. I didn't really see if there's anything else big that happened this week. It seemed like it was just a bunch of he said, she said bullshit when I looked at headlines.
And that was pretty much my experience.
Yeah.
I don't have a whole lot in my notes for the past week. Everything pretty much on trend overall. I did see India whip out the CAA again, so that's going to be in the news soon. We talked about that years ago, way back in 2019, when they first tried to pass it. And they ended up scrapping it because of the pandemic. But I think I even said at the time, this is going to be a thing again at some point. They're going to bring it back. This isn't just going to disappear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, do you remember this?
I don't think so.
So the CAA was a bill that was passed, that they want to pass, specifically the government wants to pass, that is nominally about giving refugee status to Hindus in specifically, I think, eastern India. It applies to the entirety of India, but if there are Hindus, I think specifically they have Bangladesh in mind. So if there are Hindus in Bangladesh who want to flee and seek refuge in India, the world's only Hindu state, nominally, then they would be able to claim citizenship on account of this law if it passes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they're framing it as. However, that's not actually what it's going to do in practice. Well, I mean, it will do that in practice, but that's not what it's intended to do. They've actually got something else in mind here. The trouble here is that a whole bunch of people in West Bengal, in particular, which borders Bangladesh, are people who are refugees from Bangladesh. They fled from Bangladesh during the War for Independence back in the 1970s. And a lot of those people are effectively citizens of India at this point, but they don't have paperwork. They were never given proof, of citizenship. And what's going to happen because of the law is that a lot of these people are going to be deported.
Oh.
So, if you are a Hindu, for example, then you're going to get your paperwork. If you're a Hindu who fled from Bangladesh in the 70s and you're still there, then you can get the paperwork easily because you can just file as a refugee under the CAA and you'll be fine. But if you're a Muslim, that's not going to be the case. Now, it's not inevitable. They could just genuinely pass this and implement it as the reform that they say it's going to be, the refugee, basically, reform that they say it's going to be. But the fear is that they're going to actually use it to crack down on these at this group of people who have ambiguous citizenship. And there's millions of people like that. There are millions of Muslims living in West Bengal who have status like that. And if they decide to crack down after they pass this law, then they're not going to have much choice but to go back to Bangladesh, even though they haven't lived there in half a century. And it's going to be a pretty severe disruption for a lot of them. Now, if you're wondering why they would want to do that at all, it's because Muslims, for one, are kind of controversial amongst conservative Indians at this point. Hindutva people, which is Hindu supremacists, basically, they kind of have a hair up their ass about Muslims in India. They see them as sort of the colonial enemy, the original colonizer. Muslims invaded India repeatedly over the course of India's history, and some of the experiences could be quite traumatic, especially some of the earlier ones. And Hindutva nationalists believe that their influence should be expunged from India. Some of the more radical ones go so far as to say that India should tear down the Taj Mahal because that was built by a Muslim emperor back during the Mughal Empire.
Wow.
Yeah, they're pretty radical. Yeah, that doesn't even get into the militias, the so-called cow vigilantes. In India, Hindus are generally vegetarian. Not always, and even the vegetarians are pretty inconsistent. But in general, they don't eat meat. But Muslims, of course, have no appropriation. Have no rules against, no religious rules anyway, against eating specifically meat from cows. Not pigs. There is a rule against pigs, but cows are fine. So that creates religious tension for the most radical of the Hindutva. And so some of them actually started forming militias that would go out and basically patrol areas where they knew Muslims who worked with beef were. And so they would pull over their trucks, and if they found cows in them, they would interrogate them. Sometimes they would beat them, and there have been reports of people actually being killed by these militias.
They were talking to the cows or talking to the people ferrying the cows?
Sorry, the people ferrying the cows.
Gotcha. It's funny you mentioned this because I actually watched a documentary last Wednesday that was on the ethics of religious groups killing and eating animals, for religious reasons or just for personal reasons, and what the different codes were for Christianity, Islam, and then Buddhism and other faiths, to kind of see what they did to either rationalize their choices or just kind of describe what their traditions were and how different ritual sacrifices were done. There's halal food that you can get, which is killed in the proper way for Islamic tradition, and then you have kosher, which is the Jewish way of preparing food. You have to kill the animal in a certain way, this kind of thing. And it was interesting, they actually mentioned India because I think it's illegal to slaughter cattle in the country, strictly speaking, but there is a really big underground group, not really super underground because all the cops and border people are all in on it, where they let them take in huge trucks of lots of cows for different festivals and that kind of thing, because there are a bunch of different religious groups and interpretations within India, and not all of them are going to be as favorable to making sure cows are kept sacred and safe. For some of them, they want them for meat or for dairy, or I don't know, religions have a lot of other reasons that they kill animals, but they showed a lot of footage of one of these festivals in India where there were some, I'm not sure if they're gurus or whatever, but there's some kind of religious leaders in the center, and they were deciding how many animals were going to be sacrificed that year relative to how many had been brought, and they were using different magics and stuff from their way to determine this. But yeah, pretty interesting hearing everyone's perspective. The documentary itself was definitely in favor of eating plant-based and practicing compassion to animals, and it showed a lot of the factory farm cruelties and things like that. The thing that caught me off guard, I guess, was that it ended up framing Jesus Christ from the Bible as the hero of the story, which was kind of cool. I wasn't expecting it. I honestly thought I was going to be really critical of Christianity and be Christianity is causing us to eat animals and cause them to suffer and stuff. And I was prepared for that kind of angle from it, but it actually went a different direction. And it talked about a lot of Jesus's miracles and how none of them involved the killing of animals. And whenever he's eating with his disciples and stuff for communion is technically vegan. It's wine and bread. There's no animal product involved in that ritual, so that one's safe. And then on top of that, no one could really envision Jesus killing an animal for dinner. It just seems wrong, because if you have an innocent lamb or whatever, you picture Jesus holding the lamb like it's an animal that needs to be taken care of, kind of a thing. You don't usually think of Jesus stabbing shit. That doesn't really make sense. So they went through different biblical texts of whenever Jesus goes to the Jewish temple or the synagogue, and he ends up in the morning, he blocks the entrance one of the days. Actually, I should back up. He goes to scout the temple when he gets to Jerusalem, which is the big city at the time, where all the head honchos of religion and stuff would be for the time. And Jesus is of a very different opinion on a lot of matters to like traditional Judaism at the time. And he's also kind of taking the stance of being anti-corruption. And he's basically calling out the people in this temple as practicing a lot of different kinds of businesses. Like they were ritually sacrificing animals there because that was a part of Jewish tradition in order for you to atone for your sins. Instead of like a Christian praying to God for forgiveness, you would offer an animal sacrifice to God. And that was your way of giving up some of your share of the stuff as a show of faith that God's going to take care of you. So there was meaning associated with why you would kill the animal. But this was basically monetized and made into a business that the priests and stuff were doing. And they're kind of going to be doing it for profit too, right? So it's not really something that was ethically sound. It's basically just using the animals as just shit that you show up and kill just for religious points. So for Jesus to interrupt that aspect of the business, obviously there were other things that were happening in the temple as well, but the documentary focused on that element of because Jesus contested the system that was there, and also because he always practiced compassion with basically everyone he interacted with, he was basically a hero for the animals. And because Christians no longer sacrifice animals because Jesus sacrificed himself, he also saved all the animals that would have been sacrificed if he didn't save that, or if he didn't end that tradition. So I was kind of blown away, where I thought it was going to be like Christianity is bad. All this stuff is bad because they have power. And it was like, actually Jesus was pro animal safety and kindness and stuff, so you should be too.
Huh.
Yeah, didn't suspect it. But the main guy who kind of drove the conversation was a Christian guy who was like a worship singer. I don't remember what instrument he played, but that was kind of his role in church. And he felt like that was a question that wasn't really addressed by his church. And to be honest, a lot of Christians think that veganism is kind of weird or silly or something like that, just because it's a newer way of thinking about how to manage your diet. It's not really as old historically as Christianity is. But this guy was both. He was a vegan guy and a Christian, and he was trying to figure out, as a Christian, how should you navigate that in a Christ-like way? So, interesting question. It wasn't really rallying super hard against a certain company in particular, but it did look at some connections between some religious leaders and then just direct like factory farm companies and so on. And that is a part of lobbying that exists, where companies will back politicians who are going to make policies that help them. That's pretty known. So they basically laid out a few of those relationships as well. But overall, interesting and cool. Even if you don't agree with everything in it, I feel like it's a good conversation driving movie. And it also is interesting just to see how different people of different faiths respond to the same question, because they were pretty much all getting the same question, which was, is there a way to spiritually kill an animal, like where it's ethically sound? And it was kind of going through all these different groups, and then how do they respond to that question? What is your rationalization for it? Is it a tradition? Is it giving you favor with God in some way? And then also, how is the animal killed? So interesting stuff. But yeah, India having an underground cattle selling market, when a lot of people think, oh no, doesn't India think that cows are sacred? India is too big of a place to put everyone into a category, other than that they're in India at the time.
Well, I think it is legal to harvest cattle, to raise cattle and sell them and butcher them. There are restrictions. You know, I imagine if there's corruption, it's with regard to circumventing those. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of bureaucracy in India, and even more corruption. So no shock there that there might be shenanigans going on. Mm-hmm. But it is technically legal. That's one of the controversial one of the more controversial aspects of the cow vigilante issue, because they are actually just killing innocent people when they do that. Mm-hmm. But not breaking the law at all, generally. Mm-hmm. That is to say, the people that are trying to sell cows and cow meat
that's fine. Like there's no reason to mess with those people, but for religious reasons, these militias form and try to meddle with them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the CAA is basically designed to appeal to those Hindutva folks.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's meant for. They talk about refugees for Hindus, but the suspicion is that it's going to be a backdoor for mass expulsions of Muslims whose citizenship is not entirely clear. It's also meant to appeal to people in Assam. I've been talking about West Bengal thus far, but in Assam, which is northeast of Bangladesh, they've had an issue with ethnic Bengalis, be they citizens or refugees from Bangladesh, moving into Assam. And the ethnic Assamese population does not like it. They see them as outsiders, foreigners, and interlopers. And they've been complaining for more than half a century now about these people moving into their territory. So the BJP is allied with the main local regional political party in the province/state. I guess it's the state of Assam. And in order to appeal for them, they may try to present this bill, the CAA bill, as a reason that people in Assam should vote for the BJP in the upcoming election. So again, nothing is set in stone. Maybe they pass the bill and there's just a couple refugees that come and live in India and get citizenship. But the worst case scenario that people are concerned about is mass expulsion of millions of Muslims, mostly likely from West Bengal and Assam. We'll see what they do. India's track record as far as human rights has not been the best over the past 10 years. It's kind of been deteriorating over time. So keep your eye on that.
What listening to? Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to World Discussion with Agent Smith, which is a live broadcast where we are talking about the world. You may partake in it and correct us if we mess anything up. You may also give us donations and tips, such as Sea of Whiskey has. Thank you, Sea of Whiskey. Most excellent, sire. Yeah, India is a really, really rich and interesting place that has a lot of stuff going on and a lot of people doing things differently.
Oh, yeah, I'd really like to get in and learn the politics of each individual state. I had been reading a book from the 70s about India and specifically its politics, and then very interesting. It kind of fractured, basically. In the 1970s, it had been almost all Indian National Congress, right? That was the political party, and they kind of ran everything at all levels of government. But people started breaking away and founding their own parties, mostly because of Indira Gandhi. It's one of my recurring villains. If you've listened to me long enough, you probably heard me rant about her before. But she had a very negative impact on the course of the INC's evolution. And one of the impacts of that was that all of these regional parties started sprouting up. To a degree, they were already there, but they really started gaining popularity in the 70s. And there was also a lot of new opposition parties from former INC members that propped up at the same time. And what happened is that these parties were generally led by charismatic individuals, people who kind of ran on their own popularity rather than necessarily policy. I think pretty much the communists are the only party in India to really successfully run on policy rather than on personality. And even then, their fate has generally tracked more with charismatic leaders of the party rather than changes in broader public sentiment regarding the role of the state in the economy. So, politics in India tends to be pretty personalistic. It tends to be very dependent on individual charisma. And the result of that, especially after the fracturing of the INC, is that you ended up with these sort of fiefdoms emerging, where parties would dominate one or the other state, generally in coalition with one of the larger parties. There's a whole shit ton of new parties that emerge. So large coalitions have pretty much become the norm over the past 20, 30 years in India. But generally, the backbone of these coalitions is one or two parties. And generally, the most important parties are run by dynasties. So the charismatic individuals that were able to win power in states in the 70s and 80s, generally formed dynasties and passed control of their party and, by extension, their state onto their sons. And dynasties like this generally kind of defined a lot of regional politics in India and continue to do so. So I kind of want to go in and map it, basically. My inner statistician wants to just kind of categorize them and map them for the sake of memory. Yeah, I know some of them, but I don't know if I can recall any from memory. But yeah, it would be a challenge to learn all of them. There's a whole bunch in there.
Thanks all for tuning in to Agent Smith's Indira Gandhi rant number 234. We look forward to episode number 235. Credit to Twitch chat for that one. Lol, why are you guys talking about India? Well, India is a very large country with a large number of people, which means there are a lot of things to talk about within India.
Yeah, not a lot of people really know much about India here in the US. It definitely flies under the radar.
Mm.
I think probably the most exposure India gets here in the US is via the diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
First generation and second generation immigrants who come here. But they themselves tend to fly under the radar. Like, they integrate pretty seamlessly into American society, so people barely notice them, I feel.
Oh, India surpassed China as the most populous country?
Yeah, that happened, I think, last year, I want to say. So it is technically the largest country by population now.
Oh, yep. Pretty close still. India has 1.4286 billion. Oh, this is a mid-year estimate. 1.426 versus 1.457. So off by some millions, but yeah, India recently passing them.
Well, they're definitely going to keep their lead. China's population is famously in decline.
Mm-hmm.
India's is very much expanding and is going to continue expanding for a while. If people stopped having children in India right now, right this second, and didn't have any more forever, India's population, well, I guess it would shrink at that point.
Mm-hmm.
What was the statistic I'm thinking? I think it's a replacement. I think if everybody in India had just 2 children going forward, instead of more than that, which is where they're at right now, population would still grow pretty dramatically just because there's so many young people in India.
Huh.
So that's not good. India's not as overpopulated as it's kind of stereotyped as, but there's definitely an issue in terms of generating economic growth sufficient to meet all of the new people entering India's labor market every year.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, they just don't have nearly enough good new jobs for everybody. The country is in sore need of either significant economic reform or Lebensraum, one or the other. I had an Indian friend in grad school who joked about that once.
What's
We need
Lebensraum again?
man. Living space.
Oh.
That was the Nazis' reference point for all the land they believed that they needed in order to expand Germany, mostly eastward.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I'm guessing that area would have included the parts of Russia that we talked about when we looked at the map that were kind of like a grain belt almost.
The parts of it that were west of the Ural Mountains. Germany's plan for expansion did not include expansion into Siberia.
Oh.
Their plan was to expand up to the Ural Mountains and then pretty much just to stop there. They would have actually left a rump Russian state if they had successfully won the war. But everything west of the Urals, yeah, that would have been annexed. Yeah, India's population, well, I should say India's population is very high, but if you look at the region's population, that is to say, South Asia as a region, it's crazy. Like it's so high, much higher than pretty much any other region on Earth, and by a not insignificant margin. Yeah, because Pakistan already has about 200 million. Bangladesh has about 200 million. And India was, what is it, 1.5 billion, 1.4 billion? So you add it all together, and you get pretty close to 2 billion people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the demographics of South Asia are just massive.
A lot of people there.
Yeah. Did we have anything else we wanted to touch on?
There was a question in the chat earlier. Someone asked, at Agent Smith, do we have any good news?
You guys and your good news, bah.
Humbug.
You're not going to fix anything looking at good news. I mean, I'm sure there's some good news somewhere. I just don't pay much attention to it. Haven't seen any major positive developments that I'm aware of. Yeah, it's been pretty much everything's kind of on trend. There's not a lot new or exciting happening in terms of major deviations from trend. But the trend is still pretty negative. So, there's not a lot of good news to report, unfortunately.
The other day in stream, we were messing around and thinking of different funny candidates that would be interesting to have run, that would be at least entertaining for one reason or another, and I proposed Jack Black as a president. I think he would be really funny. And it would definitely add a lot of levity to the role of president, which I think we need right now.
Yeah. I won't disagree with that. Well, I mean, as far as levity, I did have some weird stuff, if you want to talk about that.
Oh, yeah.
Did you see that there was the porn law in Texas went into effect?
No, what's the law?
So the law is that porn sites have to confirm that the people viewing their site are of age. There can't be anybody underage viewing porn in Texas now.
Uh-huh.
So that had kind of they had passed that last year, but it had been kicked around in the courts for a while because there were questions about the legality of it and whatnot. But the courts finally did allow it to go forward. So that is a thing now. Technically you are supposed to confirm your age when you view pornography online in Texas.
How did they do that? Like photo identification or like driver's license or what?
They did not specify. They kind of leave it open to the firms themselves to figure it out. Basically, if they don't do it, if they don't have some kind of mechanism to prove it, then they're open to fines. I would point out that the law itself does not specify that you will be fined if you don't have a mechanism in place. Rather, you'll get fined for each child underage who views material on your site. And the fines are pretty significant and will stack on top of each other. So each individual child is a large fine unto themselves, over $100,000 if I remember correctly. And so, that can get up pretty quickly. And I think Pornhub, RedTube, and some of the other ones no longer basically service Texas. If you go there, then they just show you a message complaining about the law and telling you to call your representatives and whatnot.
I'm guessing it's inconvenient for them is the annoyance.
Yeah, they don't want to pay big fines, right?
Yeah.
So it's a problem. It's basically what happened in Utah. There's a couple other states that have actually already done this. And there were complaints, obviously, and Pornhub and other such sites have similarly stopped servicing those markets. It's kind of stupid, though, because, like, here's the thing. The law is only relevant for entities in the jurisdiction of the state of Texas, right? So if you are an entity that is operating here, then it's a problem. And so the company that owns Pornhub and a couple of the other sites that have stopped servicing Texas, they're pretty much all owned by a company called Aylin. And I haven't been able to find out a whole lot about the company, but they obviously do have operations here, and so they are technically in Texas's jurisdiction and are open to a potential lawsuit by the Attorney General. However, if you're a website that is domiciled outside of the United States, certainly outside of Texas, you don't really have to give a shit about that. Especially if you're a foreign website, then none of this shit actually matters. So those websites are totally fine, totally unaffected. So yeah, if you are a heavy user of said material, there has been no disruption to your routine from the passage and implementation of this law.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I would note that Pornhub is a pretty mild site as far as that content goes. It's in so much as there's such a thing as mainstream porn, like that's pretty much what they specialize in. So ironically, given that a lot of the more edgy, fetish, kinky type stuff is domiciled overseas, the effect of the law may be to actually push people away from mild stuff towards more extreme stuff, since it's the latter that's going to be more available now relative to the previous moderate content.
Chad's like, I picked an awkward time to tune in. We're talking about a law that was placed in Texas recently, which makes it news. Yes, it is a horny law. However, it is still a news update. Therefore, it is valid play. Agent Smith, you are safe and you have not broken TOS yet.
Well, you said you wanted stuff that was a little on the lighter side, so that definitely qualifies. Yeah, the law is not really meant to actually stop people from viewing porn, up to and including underage people. It's just political theater. The Attorney General, Ken Paxton, here in Texas, is kind of known for that. So, he has been threatening lawsuits and doing this, that. I think he's already filed a lawsuit against Aylin Industries. So, it's all just political capital for him. It doesn't actually mean anything. Obviously, he's not the one who passed the law. That would be the actual legislators, but it's the same deal for them. It's all just red meat for their base. They don't actually expect it to accomplish anything. Lots of political theater in Texas, as much, if not more, than in the rest of the United States.
Texas has a lot of personality, and its people are very loud, opinionated, and prideful.
Oh, yeah.
Which can be a strength. It can absolutely be a strength.
So that's the goofy bullshit we're dealing with in Texas right now. There was some other goofy bullshit in Japan. There was a scandal. I found this hilarious. So there was a scandal where some members of the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is like the main political party in Japan, they've basically run Japan since they regained sovereignty after World War II. So they have a youth division. And, the youth division is sort of meant to target younger folks to try to get them excited about politics and get them voting for the LDP. But of course, the people who run the division are like old establishment guys. These are older dudes who are who have seniority in the organization. So some of these guys decided to have a meeting, and they decided to invite members of the, let's see if I can find the name here. They decided to invite members of the Glamour Dancers troupe, based in Kyoto, to their meeting. Mind you, this is not a political group. As the name implies, these are basically just strippers. These are female dancers, right? Young ones at that. So they were invited to the meeting, not to contribute to the discourse, but basically to entertain the other guests. And there is apparently video footage that was leaked to the media of the dancers sitting on the laps of the LDP members, and apparently also of them giving notes to the dancers by having the dancers use their mouths to take money out of their mouths.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this blew up into a thing, right? Everybody said, hey, that's dumb. It's a waste of money. And there's already been a string of scandals in Japan that have been afflicting the LDP's popularity for the past couple of years.
Is this a tax-deductible business meeting? Can we deduct this? It was for a meeting.
I'm sure they would try. Well, anyway, the party and, well, civil society generally, challenged the LDP on this and asked, certainly they asked the people who organized the meeting why they had these dancers at the meeting. And so what do you think the excuse was, Neuro? Ballpark guess.
Team building.
Team building. Not bad. So the excuse they went with is because they wanted to ensure that the meeting had, quote unquote, diversity. Very few female members in the LDP. And because they didn't have any women attending the meeting, they apparently felt it necessary to ensure diversity by inviting strippers. It will not surprise you to know that that excuse satisfied nobody.
Wow.
And he was made to resign.
Wow. Jeez. All right, we got the meeting coming up. Anything that we need to make sure we do before the meeting? Yeah. I was thinking that because there are no women, we should invite some women. Like, that's a great idea. All right, ideas. Let's get some ideas of any women we could invite. And one guy's like, what about strippers? And they're like, that's a good idea. Put it down. Let's schedule that. They just go with it.
Yeah, it's especially funny because there's been an ongoing issue in Japan about female participation in politics as well as the broader economy. And the LDP has been particularly criticized for its lack of female members, given that it is pushing very hard to get more women in the workforce in order to try to juice the Japanese economy. And so, their efforts to deal with that have left much to be desired, and this whole incident just underlined that.
Why do they not have very much female representation?
It's just a Japanese culture thing. Like, Japanese culture in general is very much male-dominated, and women in Japan have found it relatively difficult to penetrate into the upper echelon of both the economy and the political system. It's been an issue for a very long time. Very few Japanese governments have ever considered it a priority, though. And the only reason the Abe government started trying to boost female participation in the economy is because he wanted to make it part of his platform to rejuvenate and reform the Japanese economy and start generating growth again. And that effort pretty much failed. It's always been very difficult to change the minds of a Japanese society that still does not really see women as being entirely equal. Obviously, there are people who do in Japan. Japan is a fairly liberal society, and there are people who are of a more progressive mind. But that perspective is not as broad-based in Japan as it is in other developed Western countries. And the result is a pretty significant degree of underrepresentation for women in a lot of aspects of society.
Interesting. Yeah, because they are pretty, I think, considered very developed in certain categories, but that's an area where they're lagging behind what you would normally expect to be a standard for their socioeconomic status and tech development.
Yeah. Actually, there's an anecdote here relevant to this. So obviously, the United States fought Japan in World War II. The United States defeated Japan, occupied it, and drew up a new constitution. And the United States allowed the Japanese legislature to continue to function after new elections anyway, even while the U.S. was occupying it. And when they wrote up a new constitution for them, they wanted that legislature to pass it. So there was some back and forth and negotiating between the occupation authorities and Japanese politicians about what would be in the new constitution. And, by and large, the U.S. kind of strong-armed them into accepting it, even the provisions that they didn't like. And even if it made them grumble, they largely just accepted it, swallowed their pride, and voted for it. However, there was one provision in the Constitution that had them on the verge of revolt. It didn't matter that they were under occupation, that they were being threatened, that the US Army was everywhere. There was one thing that made them almost very nearly turn on the occupation, and that was the provision that gave women the right to vote. That was the most controversial thing. It was the thing that set them off more than anything else. Even the thing about pacifism that we wrote into the Constitution, which a lot of conservatives in Japan hated, even that did not upset them as much as giving women the right to vote. That drove them fucking crazy. And it took a lot of strong arming to get them to shut up and finally just accept it.
Damn, didn't know that. So I guess that means there's going to be a feminist movement at some point in the future in Japan, probably, where they catch up. I guess it's probably already, there are people who are pushing for that, I would suppose.
Yeah, it's already there. It just hasn't gotten much traction.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there is such a thing as a conservative woman.
Yeah,
some people tend to forget that. You know, it's not as though every woman is born to be a progressive liberal. Like, a lot of them actually are pretty conservative and don't take issue with traditional conservative notions about womanhood, and a woman's role in society. So, you know, there's a lot of people like that in Japan. Certainly in the United States, we have quite a few, but in Japan, probably a little more.
It makes sense. A lot of people do favor traditions, and one of the things that a lot of people argue about nowadays is gender roles and so on.
Yeah.
People have very strong opinions about what the roles should be, who should keep them.
Yeah, I would point out, too, that feminism is a worldwide phenomenon. You know, it manifests everywhere, and it does have an international element to it. You know, there is kind of a common intellectual heritage there. You know, common intellectual thinkers, ideas, whatnot. But radical feminism, as we think of it in the United States, is largely seen as an American thing abroad. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things about radical feminism, specifically radical American feminism, that a lot of people outside of the United States don't really like. And so there actually is not insignificant opposition, even from feminists overseas, to what they see as a sort of overly radical American strand of feminism.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, Japanese feminism, you know, as well as just feminism abroad generally, tends to take on a very different hue and tenor than feminism as we think of it here in the U.S.
Mm.
You know, you kind of saw some of that back during the peak Me Too era,
mm-hmm.
you know, sort of 17-ish, whenever it was. You know, that gained a lot of traction, not only in the United States, but in other countries. But you kind of saw pushback overseas in certain quarters. You know, French feminists in particular, I noted, tended to speak out a little more against it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's not as controversial here in the United States, but in other places, yeah, you'll see resistance even from like-minded ideologues. I think Americans still suffer a little bit from the notion that we're sort of leaders in the field, well, not only in a lot of economic areas, but also intellectually. But not every idea here is a winner. They can't all be home runs. There are some ideas that originate in the United States and that kind of spread abroad that are unpopular. Mm-hmm. They don't gain traction in the way some other ideas do, you know. American democracy, American notions of liberal democracy, freedom of speech, rule of law, you know, stuff like that, people like. You know, they can respect that. Even some of the things that people don't necessarily respect as much, well, even don't necessarily like as much, they can still at least understand and respect, like, say, gun culture in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that's going to vary from person to person. But then there's just some ideas that people think are just weird. You know, radical feminism is one of them. Libertarianism is probably another one. You know, there's a lot of just sort of quirky ideas that we think of as normal here in the United States because they've just been a constant part of our history and politics. But overseas, they kind of see that and think, wow, that's freakish. Why do you guys do that?
Mm-hmm.
I think Americans don't really understand that our intellectual tradition is not pristine clean. Not everything is exportable.
True. We do our fair share of dumb shit in the United States of America. Praise God.
Yeah, Americans like to look at Japan as this weird nation that does a lot of weird shit. But you can do that with any nation, and the United States in particular produces more than enough material for foreigners to do that to us.
Japan definitely has interesting cartoons.
Well, that's true. That's true. I concede that point, but I would point out that a nation as conservative and as religious as the United States probably should not also be the world's leading producer of pornography.
You know, I think that repression leads to people like really acting out, and they've been repressed for a long time. So those poor artists are just trying to express themselves as best they can with the censorship and repression. Yeah, it put an interesting strain on the creative process of artists, which ended up causing them to blossom with a bunch of really weird shit that's very specific and varied that you kind of use to work around the laws and so on. So in a sense, laws aren't really meant to stop people from doing things. They're just meant to heavily inconvenience doing things to where people just, for convenience, end up working around them in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. But it's a weird dichotomy. People overseas notice that stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that was the Japanese scandal. If you wanted some weird news, there you go.
That was pretty silly. Someone was like, man, can't believe that idea didn't work. That was such a good idea.
Man, that was a Hail Mary pass.
Yeah. Pray. If this works, we're going to brag about this for the rest of our lives. Or it could erupt into a scandal and we get in big trouble. You think we should do it? Yup. So silly. The human is a primate species that does silly things sometimes.
Unfortunately so.
Well,
Oh, I should do the usual disclaimer before I forget again. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this because I can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, but I will see it eventually. I do enjoy the feedback.
yeah. Now there's a debate going on. Is the U.S. a good country or not? And yeah, it depends on who you ask, and it also depends on what metrics you're using to define what a good country is. So that would be your set of priorities for where you want to live and what you think should be there.
Yeah, it's a subjective question, but I would also go further and say that there's no such thing as a country. There's no such thing as a good country or a bad country. They're just entities. It's important not to overly anthropomorphize countries. The unit of analysis should be individual people, maybe institutions, if you like. But countries, they're just expressions of, they're manifestations and expressions of their people more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we did have a little bit of Israel stuff. If we want to set chat on fire, we could talk about that.
Sure. All right, chat. Keep it together. Try your best. Be respectful of others. Remember, this is a sensitive subject, and some people will lose their shit. So try to de-escalate whenever conflicts are going to arise. All right? Okay.
It's not too much of an update. It's just some recent going-ons. Basically, the Biden administration is getting increasingly frustrated with the Israeli government and its unwillingness to kind of bend as far as the operation in Gaza. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Biden administration wants them to try to produce some kind of plan that involves more humanitarian aid for the Palestinian people, and that will also bring combat operations to something resembling a successful close. And sort of the red line that the Biden administration has laid out is Rafah. I think we've talked a little bit about it before. It's the border town through which most of the aid going into Gaza at this point is going through. It's also a primary transit point for just trade generally between Gaza and Egypt. So a huge chunk of Gaza's population is basically taking refuge in and around Rafah at this point. There hasn't been a lot of combat operations there. So Israel wants to change that. You know, they want to go into Rafah and try to clean out Hamas and destroy their tunnels and other infrastructure. And the trouble is that while the Israeli government says that there's going to be due consideration of humanitarian concerns, sufficient aid, and relocation of the civilian population, the Biden administration basically doesn't really believe that. Or if it does believe it, doesn't think it will be sufficient to deflect significant criticism from either the American electorate or the broader global public. So in turn, the Biden administration has been going out of its way to escalate its opposition to Israeli operations in Gaza. It's been pretty mild up till now. Occasionally they'll apply sanctions to maybe some individuals committing crimes in the occupied territories in the West Bank. A couple settlers have been sanctioned for violence against Palestinians. I don't think any politicians yet, mostly just individual settlers. I think they did sanction maybe a company or something that operates in the West Bank. Other than that, all of the pressure has been rhetorical, you know, just criticizing the Israeli government's approach, asking them very diplomatically and politely but forcefully to try to change tack and to consider alternatives. None of that stuff has really been working. And so there's been two changes more recently. One, the Senate Majority Leader, a guy named Chuck Schumer, a Democrat, came out and actually just full-on called for new elections in Israel. And he stated, quote, allowing his political survival to take precedence over the best interests of Israel, saying that Netanyahu is doing that. So that's very unusual. That's a very forceful statement. I know it sounds kind of bland if you're not really following Israel-Palestine politics much or American foreign policy, but it's very unusual for a leading U.S. politician to actually just call for new elections in an ally. It's not unusual for the United States to call for new elections in like Russia or Iran or whatnot, but generally it's policy in the United States to not intervene in the politics of allied nations. So this is actually a break with that norm. And this signifies the degree of discontent within American politics about the war in Gaza. You know, the fact that he's willing to go this far to kind of break that norm is really evidence of that. So that was one notable event. There's also reportedly sanctions being considered in Europe targeting settlers in the West Bank, akin to the American sanctions. Normally, Europe kind of takes a backseat to that stuff. It's kind of a hot button issue, especially in Germany, for obvious reasons, to apply sanctions on Israel. But sanctions at the European Union level have been gaining traction, and that could actually happen, which would also be a notable change. I think the most significant recent development was a vote at the UN. Normally, the United States goes out of its way to use its Security Council veto to block any General Assembly votes. What are they called? Referendum? Yeah, I don't remember. Basically, they voted to try to condemn the war in Gaza and to ask for an immediate ceasefire. You know, the UN General Assembly has voted on that repeatedly, and the U.S. has continually blocked it. But recently, the United States hinted that it might not veto a measure like that if it were brought up again. And there was some wrangling. You know, it's still not calling for an immediate ceasefire. But the measure that the United States did end up refraining from vetoing actually did call for greater actions by Israel as far as the humanitarian situation in Gaza. So that itself was pretty significant. It's worth noting that that measure ended up getting vetoed by Russia and China, ironically, specifically because it did not call for an immediate ceasefire. They believed that the language was too weak and that it was basically just theater by the U.S. government. So even though the United States finally refused to block a measure on behalf of Israel, it still ended up getting vetoed anyway, just because of UN politics, basically. The Biden administration, for its part, has openly said now that Israel should not invade Rafah, and also that it would support a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire, although obvious the previous resolution was not sufficient in that regard, in order to get past China and Russia anyway. So, all of this does represent a change from the previous American position. It does not represent a wholesale break from Israel. You can tell that the Biden administration is still kind of trying to toe the line between being an ally of Israel and pressuring Israel on what is in the United States a very unpopular war. Certainly the occupation of the West Bank is a particular sore point and continues to antagonize mostly people on the political left. But a growing proportion of the left is increasingly in that camp. So the Biden administration is squeezed from both sides on this. It can't be too anti-Israel, but it also can't be too pro-Israel. And so in so much as the Biden administration has had a very halting, ad hoc, equivocating policy on the war in Gaza, it's because they're trying to walk this tightrope. And it's, all the more challenging a tightrope because this is an election year. So everything they do is magnified and criticized by the opposition. So some change in the direction of pressuring Israel, but nothing so significant at this point that Israel could not basically just ignore them. Mm-hmm. It would probably take a lot more pressure at this point to get the Israeli government to back off and to actually take a more moderate conciliatory approach to the war in Gaza. So no change as of now to the current trend of the war in Gaza continuing and the situation on the ground for the people continuing to deteriorate. That's probably going to continue. Where the Biden administration goes from there is an open question. If they drop the hammer to prevent an attack on Rafah, that would be certainly a significant event in the history of Israeli-American relations. But it's specifically because of that fact that I doubt they're going to do it. But at the same time, the situation on the ground will just continue to deteriorate and pressure will grow on the Biden administration to do something about it. And how they deal with that, I don't know. It's an increasingly difficult political corner that they are in right now, and there's no way they can get out of it without pissing off some significant chunk of the voting public. Mm. So they're either going to get really creative or they're going to get really dumb. One or the other. There's basically no other way out of a political corner like this. We'll see which it is. Watch this space.
We'll see what happens. Yeah, it is tough to take the ideal stance in a situation like that because you can't really, with good conscience, universally cheer for what either side is doing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a long-running conflict. It's really taken on a life of its own at this point, and there's no clear-cut resolution that would satisfy voters in the United States right now, and that would be viable in Israel and Palestine. Those are basically two mutually exclusive things at this point.
Yeah.
So hopefully that didn't blow up chat too much.
It doesn't seem too crazy. Mods haven't been having to time people out. We do have a lot of good mods around. Thanks, mods, for keeping people within the boundaries required of us by Twitch.tv.
Much appreciated.
Mm-hmm. We have gotten quite a few spicy YouTube comments recently. There was someone who was very pro-Putin, saying that he's been cleaning up a lot of their government of spies and traitors. So there was someone who wanted to express that.
Oh yeah, you're going to get Russian nationalists. That's a real group there. So no surprise. That's a thing. It's unfortunate that they've gotten as influential in government as they are at this point, but so it goes. That's history for you. Yeah, unfortunately, Russia had the option of modeling itself and its future course of development on any country, or any combination of countries of its choice after the Cold War ended. They could have gone laissez-faire American. They could have gone for more of a social democratic managerial approach like Germany. Could have gone with Japan, more statist approach. Lots of options, right? And they kind of tried different things, but ultimately at this point it seems they've settled on Serbia. Russia at this point is basically Serbia Majora, and that's not an ideal outcome given Serbia's modern history. But given the affinity between them, maybe it's not surprising. Good luck dealing with that, Europe. I don't envy you. Well, we did have some questions. I guess we actually had some from last week.
Fire away.
What about the European elections in June and the French 2027 elections that may be won by Le Pen? How could these affect the war in Ukraine? Probably exactly as you'd expect. Like in general, Le Pen and her party, the name of which I keep forgetting, has been more Russophile. That is to say, they've generally been more favorable to having normal, cordial relations with Russia. At the same time, they've had to shift their position on that over the past couple of years because supporting Ukraine and opposing Russian aggression has been seen as more necessary for the security of Europe writ large. So Le Pen and her party have felt obligated then to try to moderate their stance. They'd already been moving away from Russia a bit. Their party famously used to receive money from Russia. So they've been trying to create distance over time. But over the past 2 years in particular, they've been trying to sound and to act much more Atlanticist than they had been. So it's not inevitable that if Le Pen did win, that it would necessarily represent an immediate and sharp break with Ukraine, as well as with the larger Atlanticist security architecture of Europe. Maybe she would be less inclined to participate in assisting Ukraine. Maybe there would be less money, but it would not necessarily be an immediate break. At the same time, though, I can't guarantee that. Maybe it would be. Maybe she gets into power and just decides to go for some dramatic changes. Might be hard if she doesn't have a legislative majority, but we'll see. If Le Pen and her party wins both presidency and gets a majority in the legislature, that's going to portend some pretty significant changes in France. I think Ukraine is going to be the least of their problems at that point. But we'll see what happens. I mean, Giorgia Meloni won power in Italy as a explicitly right-wing candidate, if not a populist right-wing candidate. And, she's actually been pretty status quo on national security issues. She's retained Italy's Atlanticist orientation, and so there's been relatively little change in that regard. And not necessarily the most enthusiastic supporter of Ukraine, but they have been supporting it. So maybe Le Pen ends up being very similar in that regard.
Interesting.
Oh, I guess I'm talking about the 2027 elections there. As for the European elections in June, they don't really matter. I mean, it's the European Parliament, right? I don't want to knock the European Union too much, but the European Parliament has very much been a third wheel within the European Union ever since its inception. Have you ever heard of the European Parliament, Neuro?
The European Parliament? Oh,
Yeah.
like the EU one?
Yeah.
The one that doesn't really have the power to do anything?
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay, yes, I remember us talking about this, how they can issue judgments upon things, but they don't have the power of enforcement of anything. So it's kind of like they can grumpily talk about you in their office.
Yeah. Yeah, it was created to try to address concerns that the European Union was not sufficiently democratic, since basically all of the positions are filled by appointees from national governments rather than being elected. But the trouble is that the European Parliament just has not been granted sufficient power within the European Union as an institution in order to really flex that elected authority. So, the European Council and the European Executive are still very much in charge as far as European Union policymaking. Although I would point out that it's really the member states that are the prime force behind European Union policymaking. The Council in particular is the main driver there. The Council is basically just filled with permanent representatives appointed by member states, and they're the ones who really make the big decisions, ultimately. The executive can do lots of regulatory stuff, lots of administrative stuff, but they can draw up laws, but ultimately it all requires the unanimous consent of all of the member state representatives in the Council. So that's like the real seat of power within the European Union. So until the Parliament has something resembling equal status, at the very least like a substantive veto, nobody's really going to care that much. It just doesn't really sufficiently matter to be a major institution unto itself.
Gotcha. Chat's asking about if this Parliament group has been blocking weed legalization in Germany. Maybe they heard in Germany that was the thing that's stopping it. I don't know why that would be, because there are EU member states that have weed legal. Doesn't Netherlands?
I'm pretty sure legalization of weed is something reserved for member states to decide. I don't think there's a European policy on that. I don't think there ever would be either. I don't think that's something that member states would give up. Yeah, I've never heard about a effort to try to pass a bill at the European level. That is to say, by the European Union as an institution to try to legalize weed. Yeah, so maybe I just don't know enough about it. If so, let me know. I would be interested in looking into it, but I'm extremely skeptical that any country in the European Union would want to give up the power to regulate that issue. Because that's an issue that definitely has a lot of variance in terms of how publics feel about it from country to country. So I don't think there's ever going to be like a single European policy on that. But I could be wrong. I'm open to new information on that point.
Chat saying it was the health minister using that as an argument of why they kept delaying it. Yeah, another thing too is it can be sometimes tricky because the law that would legalize it comes with some stipulations where even the people who are pro-weed wouldn't want it to go through because it would restrict their business too much or their use too much in some way. So that's why a lot of the weed bills in certain states in the US would also fail, would be if they had too many regulations or it was taxed too heavily, that kind of a thing. They would basically want to not have it pass then to go for a better shot and a better deal later on. I'm not sure how much of it is that for Germany specifically, but yeah.
Yeah, I haven't been following the legalization debate in Germany. I followed the prostitution debate. I found that much more interesting. They actually did legalize that. But I don't know what they've been doing with marijuana.
From what I've heard, legalizing sex work is very good for protecting the people who work in the industry, and basically everyone gets more protected because there are more guarantees and regulations for people involved. You're not as reliant on like the local pimps conducting their business well.
Yeah, that's the benefit. And certainly the way they regulate it and run it in Germany
does suggest that's a viable approach. And there's definitely been an improvement in the working conditions that a lot of the women working in the profession have faced. But it's not a panacea, right? There's still lots of women that are coerced into sex work by either pimps or boyfriends or abusive relatives or whomever. So that aspect has not really changed and probably never will. That aspect of the trade is extremely difficult to tackle. Even some of the women working in the official regulated brothels are women who are trafficked. And they just don't feel that they can say anything without some kind of severe repercussions from the people who trafficked them. So, it's just difficult to create a sex industry in which there is no coercion, because it's very difficult to parse who's there voluntarily and who's not. So you can regulate it and improve general conditions, but even in the regulated spaces, there's still going to be people who are coerced, and there's always going to be an unregulated black market and prostitution, the low end of the market, so to speak. That's going to continue to exist, and that's going to continue to be particularly abusive. So that's always going to be out of reach of the regulatory state. So, a broader solution to the deeper problem of women being abused and trafficked and whatnot is going to have to go beyond the confines of a mere debate about whether or not to legalize prostitution. You need a much broader range of changes, both social and legal, in order to substantively deal with that.
Yeah, a lot of people won't want to legalize it because they think it's a thing that should never happen, maybe for like religious reasons or personal reasons in some sense. So they wouldn't. Huh?
I was going to say there are feminists who use that same logic. Yeah, it's not just conservatives. There are actually people on the left who also think it should not be legalized because they see it as perpetuating a culture of objectification and dehumanization of women.
Flip side is that's a way that they can run a business if they choose to. So in the sense of individuals who elect that for themselves and they're not pressured in any way, it seems like a market that they should be allowed to enter and use at their discretion. So yeah, that's one of the things where legalization, having things above water, making sure like operations are conducted with protections for the people involved, it seems like it benefits everyone if it's a behavior that's kind of not going away anyway. There's a reason they call it the oldest profession.
Yeah.
So want people to stay safe, stay smart, also grant people the rights that they need. But yeah, you're right, there is room for people's opinion too. Opinions are valid. Many people hold their opinions very strongly. Feel free to share your opinions in the chat as long as you do so respectfully. Yeah, the thing that's a little bit silly, if you get kind of down to the fundamentals of like sex work in general or pornography, you're basically offering services and or experiences or content in a way that certain people believe that to be immoral in its nature, but it depends on who you ask for that. So it's definitely still something that's being assessed by society. Trisha's saying, I love my sluts in the chat. Yeah, I told Agent Smith earlier today about the two Christians that we passed by on the walk to the festival. And people know that ravers tend to show a lot of butt. And there was definitely that. And there was a man who was judging us viciously as we were passing by, saying that it leads to other things, that if you dress with your butt hanging out, that makes you involved in sex work in the future, and that is against God. There was also another nice Christian there who was just pro-Jesus. And then there was a random person who was like a mom, and they said free mom hugs. And they were just there to give people hugs as they passed by. So that was pretty wholesome and nice.
Yeah, that's sweet.
It was a nice counterbalance. It was interesting, too, that the small old lady didn't have a megaphone, but her impact on the people who was going by was like more inspiring because she was just really nice with her actions. That's cool. Little people doing things well.
Yeah, the gentler approach will get you farther, I think. That's a better way to proselytize.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things. I think the loud approach is better if you're just advertising. Because what they say in what they say in the advertising industry is that you just need to be recognized and known. It doesn't necessarily, if it's a good or bad attention, any attention is good because it's cementing the brand rather in the target demographic's memory. So you just have to get it out there and make people remember it, and then eventually later on, when maybe they're open to a change, they'll have that in the back of their head as an alternative. So that's one approach, but if you're actually looking to change a mind on the spot, then the gentler approach is better. People will be much more receptive to that.
Yeah, as soon as you identify yourself as an opponent, usually people shut down in terms of being open to persuasion attempts from you, because that's when they put up their defenses of, oh, this is from the other faction that dislikes me, and now they're going to try to grill me, basically. And then you start to get defensive, and you think about your comebacks and how you're going to defend yourself, rather than being like, oh, wow, thank you, sir, for genuinely causing me to consider how scantily clad I am right now. I'm actually having a bit of guilt about all of this. I wasn't thinking when I was getting dressed. I was like, it's fun and hot to show so much skin. That's all I was thinking. I wasn't thinking about the Bible. Yeah, maybe someone there actually reassessed themselves, but I feel like it's not the best delivery style.
Yeah, I feel like the attendees of a rave in the desert are probably not the best target for that particular messaging.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of pushback, I imagine. Let's see. What is your opinion on Bellingcat journalist Robert Evans? I don't have one. Bellingcat does good work. Some of the biggest stories of the past 10 years were broken by Bellingcat. But I don't know enough about the individual journalists to have opinions on them. I did see this comment last week. This is one of the ones from last week, and I did look up his Wikipedia, and I was genuinely shocked to find that he started his career working for Cracked back in the day. Do you remember that?
Was that a website?
Yeah, it was a website. It's a comedy website. Yeah, there was a period when they started expanding their content, and one of the things they did is they started publishing these articles in which they talked to people in other countries or from who had unique experiences and whatnot, and they were actually really good. Generally, it wasn't necessarily like the most professional of journalism, but it was kind of like early Vice type material.
Yeah,
if you remember Vice News from back in the day.
Edgy, adventurous information.
Yeah, exactly. So it was pretty cool content, but unfortunately, Cracked kind of collapsed not long after they started doing that, and so they ended up cutting that out. And apparently, this guy was the guy behind that, much to my surprise. And he eventually just went on later to start working for Bellingcat, where apparently he has continued to do very good work. So that kind of blew my mind a little bit. I never thought one of the guys working for Cracked would go on to do like genuinely good, legitimate journalism, but here we are.
Interesting.
Well, that's at least one good thing to come out of the collapse of Cracked. At least we have that. Let's see, what else did we have here? What are your thoughts on Project 2025? Which one? Lots of countries have projects that are named like this, that, or the other Project 2025. I think China has, what is it, Made in China 2025? Is that what it was? Yeah, something like that. That project, by the way, is not going to reach its objectives. That was an industrial policy plan to try to make China largely self-sufficient on a range of strategic sensitive goods. And man, not a lot of progress. That has not panned out well. But I'm sure that's probably not the one they're asking about. So I would ask for elaboration on that. Let's see. Why did the CIA blow up the Nord Stream pipeline from Russia to Germany? I don't think they did. It's still kind of an open question who did it, right? I think the last I checked, suspicion was mostly on Ukraine's intelligence service, the SBU. They obviously had the most incentive to do it. For those of you who may be not familiar with this, there was a pipeline through which a significant amount of natural gas was transmitted from Russia directly to Germany. And it was a very controversial pipeline because it would have allowed Russia to just trade directly with its main consumer. Previously, most of the natural gas that Russia traded with the rest of Europe went through either Belarus, which itself had a pipeline that went through Poland, and then they had a pipeline going through Ukraine, which they actually still use, weirdly enough. And I think they also sent some to Europe through a Turkish pipeline as well, if I'm not mistaken. So because there were countries between Russia and Europe that natural gas had to flow through, that gave those intermediate countries leverage over Russia. If they wanted to, they could shut off the flow of Russian natural gas to Western consumers. And they could use that leverage to pressure Russia on this, that, or the other issue to try to get Russia to back off. That was what Ukraine partly tried to do. Germany didn't like that. Germany preferred to have reliable supplies of natural gas that were not at the mercy of Eastern European governments that the German government felt could be somewhat dramatic and finicky over the alleged threat posed by Russia, which the German government and as well as the broader German voting public did not feel as concerned about. So in that vein, they agreed to work to build a pipeline that would have a direct connection, that would directly connect Germany to Russia, and that could get around these other countries. And that was the Nord Stream pipeline. And the U.S. government, for its part, kind of threatened and sometimes pressured the German government in various ways to not build the pipeline because they did see it as being benefiting mostly Russia. But of course, while that's true, it also benefited Germany. It gave Germany more leverage over not only Russia, but also Eastern European states, so that Germany was not just at their mercy. So the German government obviously didn't have a problem with that, and they went forward with the construction of the pipeline correspondingly. And so then the war in 2022 happens. Russia invades Ukraine, and suddenly Nord Stream isn't looking like the best idea. Although if you're German, it probably still seems like a good idea. Again, if something happened, Germany always had it at its discretion to cut imports of natural gas. Having the direct connection did not inherently mean Germany would inevitably ignore something like a Russian invasion of Ukraine. But it did give them discretion, and a lot of Eastern European governments were not comfortable with that, given that the Germans in general were kind of passive and conciliatory towards Russia and Russian aggression. So when the war started, obviously there were sanctions applied to Russia. There was a significant curtailment in natural gas, although not in the short term. In the short term, Europe actually continued to import Russian natural gas because an immediate cutoff was not really economically viable. And so that created some concern that maybe in the long run, there would not be a significant cutoff of Russian natural gas. Maybe they would just keep importing it, which would obviously benefit Russia in its war effort. So what happened is a couple months into the war, I don't remember the exact month or date, but a couple months in the war, the Nord Stream pipeline mysteriously blew up. Somebody set off an explosive and destroyed a chunk of it that was under the Baltic Sea. And at that point, it was no longer a viable project, right? Probably they either could have repaired it by now or have already repaired it by now. I imagine the damage was not too extensive, but it did curtail the export of Russian natural gas into Europe, at least in the short term. And so that, of course, benefits Ukraine, hurts Russia, and to a degree hurts Europe in so much as it made natural gas more expensive. But the big question was, who did it? Ukraine had a reason to do it, but then some people think that the U.S. did it. Presumably the guy who asked me this question, he obviously thinks the CIA did it. So the theory there is that the United States is a major natural gas producer and wants to replace all of the Russian natural gas that had been exported to Europe with American natural gas exported as liquid natural gas from LNG terminals in the United States. The idea being that all of that money would now be directed towards the U.S. and its mega corporations, which presumably this person thinks secretly runs the U.S. government. I don't think that's the case. I don't think really energy firms are the most powerful
political entities in the United States at this point. They have significant competition. It was much easier to make the case that oil companies and to a lesser degree natural gas companies 50 years ago had disproportionate political influence in the United States. Now, though, not so much. Like it's really a services economy now. There's way bigger actors. I mean, even looking at an entity like Apple, for example, like they're much bigger than ExxonMobil, right? Mm-hmm. Certainly in terms of annual. Well, what is it? I think Apple is the most valuable company right now in terms of overall value, if I'm not mistaken. Let me check that, make sure I'm not embarrassing myself. Largest companies by market cap. Oh, Microsoft still is. Okay. $3 trillion? That's not real. Really? I guess there has been a lot of inflation in the stock market lately. Well, regardless, Microsoft, number one, according to Google here, Apple, number two, NVIDIA, number three, Saudi Arabian oil, number four there, and then Amazon after them.
NVIDIA, so, wow.
Oh, fuck yeah. The AI thing has just completely exploded the value of their company.
What AI
They've been pumping
thing?
out. Artificial intelligence has developed by leaps and bounds over the past couple years. And correspondingly, there has been a significant increase in demand for artificial intelligence microchips, which are used to power the most advanced systems and algorithms. And so NVIDIA, being the prime producer of those chips, has seen its valuation just skyrocket over the past couple of years. It's been just absolutely crazy. And of course, they also benefited from the big boom in electronics that happened during and after the pandemic. That also, helped significantly boost them. So yeah, NVIDIA is way up there now. So, we've got what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 companies listed. Of the 5 largest companies by market cap, 4 of them are basically tech companies. So yeah, Saudi Arabian oil on the list, but it's alone, right? So as far as political economy goes, I would not conclude immediately that oil companies and natural gas companies are going to be the single most powerful actors driving American foreign policy. It actually makes a lot more sense to think that tech companies are the primary influencers there. The only trouble there is that tech companies don't really have as much reason to complain, since the services sector is still largely unregulated in most countries. So, there's fewer barriers to trade there. In so much as there's negotiations about trade in that regard, it's generally about things like data localization, storage, stuff like that. So, they actually have been very active in lobbying the government on stuff like that. But in terms of things like Ukraine, for example, like, why does Apple care about that? It probably doesn't, for the most part. So yes, it's true that natural gas companies might care about it, but I don't feel like they have enough pull to just make that a priority.
Well, Starlink is a U.S. company, no?
Yeah. So, yeah, that's Elon Musk.
Yeah, so they would have a stake in the situation, at least somewhat.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But I haven't gotten the impression that Elon Musk is super invested in the conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't think he is either.
Yeah, it's not his thing. In so much as he's talked about it at all, mostly on Twitter, or X, as I guess I'm supposed to call it. I'm not calling it X. That's so dumb.
It's still twitter.com, no? Like the actual URL.
Yeah, they haven't changed the actual URL. It's still Twitter to me. It makes more sense to call it that. But anyway, in so much as he's talked about Ukraine at all on Twitter, it's generally been kind of middle of the road. Like, he seems to think that there's like a peaceable solution to the conflict that could be negotiated if somebody could come up with a creative enough proposal, which is technically possible, but is pretty outlandish at this point. If as some commentators say, Russia is in fact winning, then they don't really have any incentive to come to the table. Why not just keep winning in that case?
Yeah.
If you're Ukraine, then it doesn't really make much sense to negotiate from a position of weakness, since that means you're not going to get as much in a potential peace deal. It makes more sense to wait and see if you can't get more aid from abroad and maybe continue to reform your military to a point where you can negotiate from a position of strength. Mind you, that doesn't even necessarily have to involve retaking territory. Like, negotiating from a position of strength can just mean you have more equipment, a better trained army, more experience, basically that you can be a credible threat. So in that sense, that even that alone would improve your negotiating position. So given that there is an aid package technically in Congress right now that may or may not be passed, probably not, given how it's looking right now, but that could pass. And of course, the presidential election at the end of the year could portend big changes as well, depending on how Congress shakes out and who wins the presidency. So, both Russia and Ukraine are kind of in waiting mode on that count. But even if they're not doing great right now, it makes sense to wait, given that you could get a lot more help later. So, the war is not over by a long shot in that sense. But yeah, in general, I don't think the U.S. did it. I think it makes much more sense for the Ukrainians to have done it, since that immediately hurts their opponent, the country that's invading them. And given how wishy-washy Germany had been towards Russia and kind of continued to be after the war started, I don't think I can entirely blame the Ukrainian government for thinking that Germany's pronouncements that they would eventually significantly cut imports of Russian natural gas were not entirely credible, and that it might make more sense to take direct action. Obviously, a lot of natural gas still went to Germany through the pipeline running through Ukraine, which Russian natural gas still goes through. Everybody makes money off of that. So, both sides continue to do it. But Ukraine doesn't have, Ukraine has leverage over that because they can shut off that pipeline if they want to and influence Germany that way. Obviously, natural gas imports from Russia have since, collapsed. They're very, very low. And so much as any natural gas is still getting through to Europe, it's mostly LNG that's kind of being smuggled in through third parties. But it's collapsed significantly since then. So this whole natural gas issue has kind of obsolesced since the war started. It's not as big of an issue now as it was when it first happened in the first year, when natural gas was a major issue for Europe. It was not clear if Europe's economy, as well as its just general citizenry, would be able to cope with a major loss of a major supplier like that in the short term. As was, they kind of hobbled through. They managed. Everything kind of worked out in the long run, although it took a significant amount of effort to do so. So, it's kind of a moot point at this juncture. I think the only outstanding issue as far as the destruction of Nord Stream is whether or not Europe should be, working and cooperating with a country that committed an act that was technically a violation of sovereignty. And the answer there is going to depend on how you feel about Ukraine. I don't think if it came out tomorrow, that is to say, if evidence came out tomorrow definitively proving that the SBU blew it up, that it would really change anybody's mind, either in Europe or the United States. Like, if you're going to support Ukraine right now, I don't think you would change it because you find out that they did that. And if you opposed Ukraine before, obviously that's not going to change your mind either. So I feel like opinion is pretty fixed at this point, in so much as it's changed pretty incrementally. And most of the concern that has shifted opinion has focused on, one, the threat of nuclear war, and two, the cost of supporting Ukraine, both in terms of direct transfers in the form of financial support and in terms of military support, and then also in terms of opportunity cost, which we can define here in terms of the lost revenue from having access to relatively cheap Russian natural gas and oil, as well as other things like diesel gas that Europe had largely imported from Russia. So I don't think really it matters in the grand scheme of things who blew up Nord Stream, but in so much as it does, I think probably the SBU did it, most likely. That seems to be the most logical outcome. And again, I don't think the CIA did it. I don't think the United States cares that much about LNG exports. The industry is not that powerful, in my opinion. So let's see. Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, I got another 10 minutes or so.
Okay, yeah. I don't want to make you go long. I'm sure you're tired.
You're good.
Let's see. What changes, if any, have occurred in food procurement for countries that rely on Ukrainian wheat to ensure food security since the war with Russia started? Not much, honestly. I mean, basically, when there were disruptions to supply, there was a big spike in food inflation in those countries. Most of the countries that depend or that disproportionately depend on Russian and Ukrainian wheat for their food imports are in the Middle East. So we're talking countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, these kinds of countries. Obviously, the Gulf states don't have as much of a problem. The Gulf states have make a significant amount of money from oil exports, so they have the money to buy food from anywhere. Russian and Ukrainian wheat is pretty cheap, so it makes sense to buy from them. But if they can't, that's not a ball breaker for them. They can buy from elsewhere at slightly higher prices. That's not a big deal for the Gulf states. Now, Egypt, Lebanon, places like that don't make a lot of money from oil, they got hit pretty hard because they didn't have nearly as many. They didn't have alternative options available to them. Prices significantly spiked, and a lot of budgets in the region just kind of blew out. Because one of the things that happens in countries like Egypt and Lebanon is that the state subsidizes food. Partly that's just done to maintain the legitimacy of the government, because they're not getting that legitimacy from elections, obviously. So subsidies are one of the alternative ways to do that. But in turn, the fate of the budget of those countries that do that is disproportionately dependent on things like food inflation. Because when global food prices spike, that means that the expense of the subsidies either has to significantly spike, eating into other items on the budget, or they have to reduce the subsidies, thereby incurring immediate riots. I think we've talked before about how cutting fuel subsidies is like an immediate recipe for unrest in virtually any country. The same can be said for food subsidies. People feel that very quickly, and they get very upset about it. So there was real concern for a while about unrest in Egypt because food prices were going up. The Egyptian government tried to maintain the subsidies for a while, although I think they did eventually make some cuts. But it ended up not being a long-term problem, because eventually in, I think, mid-late 22, Russia and Ukraine negotiated the grain deal, in which Ukrainian grain could continue to be exported through the Black Sea out to export markets. So that alleviated price pressure and helped deal with that food inflation in those countries to the point where it was not nearly as much of a problem by late 22, and certainly through 23 and currently 24 as it was in the first months of the war. Keep in mind, too, there was a lot of speculative pressure on prices. In the immediate aftermath of the war, it was assumed that there would be big disruptions to grain. And so that itself just caused prices to spike significantly. So given that there was a lot of speculative pressure, it was inevitable that prices would eventually come down and normalize. So even without a grain deal between Russia and Ukraine, you still would have seen prices go down as the speculators kind of went away and as people got a better grasp of just how much disruption there was going to be. So the grain deal was icing on the cake in that sense. That actually increased supply, in addition to the coinciding improvement in sentiment. So that's not the most sexy answer. I'm sure you would have preferred to hear about tangible action by those states to try to deal with the issue. But if you don't have the money, you don't have the money. There wasn't a lot of alternative but to buy more expensive food. And given the limits on their budgets, there was only so much. They could only do that to such an extent before incurring some kind of debt crisis. So basically what they did is they just spent more in the short term and prayed that the problem would solve itself in the long run. And their prayers were answered, as it happens. So they ended up lucking out. There have been disruptions to grain exports from Ukraine since then, but given a combination of renewals of the grain deal as well as Ukrainian pressure on the Russian Navy, Ukrainian grain exports have been able to continue. And so that has continued to suppress prices on markets and ease pressure on countries like Egypt that are disproportionately sensitive to it.
Sensitive to it because of a gluten intolerance, or?
Well, I mean, Egypt does not produce enough food to feed its population, so they have to import. And because Ukrainian and Russian wheat is some of the cheapest on the market, and because they're relatively close by, they import a lot of food from them.
Så det är lund.
Yeah, a lot of countries in the Middle East obviously suffer from a lack of arable land, and so that limits their ability to produce enough foodstuffs to feed everybody in their countries.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that makes them disproportionately dependent on food imports and, by extension, disproportionately sensitive to international swings in food prices.
Mm-hmm.
So here in the United States, we don't feel that as much because we produce a shit ton of food.
Yeah, a lot of good farmland relative to the population amount.
Yeah, yeah. So when food prices swing internationally here, not too big a deal.
It probably benefits us more than anything.
Yeah, if food prices spike, then yeah, farmers do much better. Consumers here don't particularly like it, but nobody's going to hurt for lack of access, and it's not going to have a dramatic impact on, say, the value of the currency or the current accounts deficit, something like that. The overall economy is sufficiently strong that swings in international food prices don't impact us too much. And, as you say, increases in price actually benefit us since we're major food exporters. But even when, there's significant declines, like even that doesn't hurt too much. If you're a farmer, you feel that, certainly. But the overall economy and, again, the balance of trade isn't impacted. Mm-hmm. But you can't say that for Egypt, because they import so much, significant increases in food prices devalue their currency. Because, you basically have to buy food, right? You can't not. You're not going to starve people, right? So that invariably means imports increase in value. And that in turn puts downward pressure on the currency. And that, if it continues long enough, can have detrimental impacts on the overall economy in so much as it introduces inflation to the broader economy. This is what economists refer to as importing inflation. If you have to import a lot of stuff and that stuff gets more expensive, then that inflation in turn is going to transfer into your broader economy and introduce inflation there, which is going to be overall bad for the economy. There's not more economic activity, just everything's getting more expensive at the same level of economic activity. So everybody's just getting poorer in that case. Mm-hmm. And in so much as it has negative impacts on the economy in that vein, there could in turn be a debt crisis, which could in turn cause knock-on negative economic effects. So you can see how this has the potential to spiral. It's kind of an unvirtuous cycle, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So, the secret there to fending off negative impacts from disproportionate dependence on imports is just to be a large country, because that's about the only way you're going to avoid that. Mm-hmm. If you're a small country, then invariably, maybe you're self-sufficient on food, but if you're a small country, you're invariably going to be importing a lot of stuff. It's pretty much unavoidable. No country can produce everything unless it's a large country.
Well, even large countries like China is not self-sufficient for its food, right?
True. China is definitely a net importer of food. Although, interestingly, and this is an important nuance that I feel gets overlooked, I didn't know this for a long time. China is a net importer of food, but at the same time, it is actually by far the world's largest agricultural producer. They produce more food and other agricultural goods than any other country on Earth. And in fact, they produce more than the United States by a factor of like 2 or maybe even 3.
Well, India has more people. That means they have way more food per person.
Yeah, they have to consume a lot more, for sure. So they're also importers of food.
Interesting.
Yeah, being a big country with lots of arable land anyway, means that you're going to produce a lot of food. But if you have a massive population, then it's probably still not going to be enough. Especially if you experience a lot of economic growth like China has. In that case, people increase their caloric intake. They're going to consume more. And so that means that you're going to need to significantly increase cultivation in your own country or import. So China does not actually have a lot of arable land relative to its land mass. So for them, economic development inevitably meant a significant spike in food imports. There was pretty much no way they were going to meet all that. Mm-hmm. They'll try, especially given that their government is shifting more towards autarky recently. But it's probably not going to work. If they had to survive off of native grown rations to some degree, if they rationed what food they produced in country, maybe they could pull it off, but it would be tough. But as is, they don't have to ration. They can just kind of eat what they want. And what they want is lots of pork, lots of wheat, lots of soy. Soy and pork in particular are like the biggest import items. And I think most of the soy they get from Brazil at this point, but a lot of the pork actually comes from the United States.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of companies in North Carolina that make a lot of money off of the China trade, in pork specifically.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a kind of dietary preference thing, because it really could be any kind of meat, I guess, if that's what they want, but they want what goes in their signature dishes, I suppose.
Well, pork is sort of a mainstay of the Chinese diet and has been for probably millennia, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe somebody who knows better could correct me on that, but yeah, pork has always been a central dietary item, so that's kind of the go-to. Not nearly as much ground beef.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've had a number of Chinese friends over the years, and all of them are quite bemused, shall we say, by American food.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of sugar, too much sugar from their perspective, too much salt, a shocking amount of cheese.
Mm-hmm.
I think Americans take for granted just how much cheese it is in our food.
Yeah.
They really don't consume much cheese in China. That's kind of a weird thing for them.
Well, lactose tolerance is one of the driving factors there, I think.
Well, which came first, the lactose intolerance or the aversion to cheese?
The pressure point of starvation, I think, is the active factor during key time periods for certain regions. And I think it's more so for cold regions than warm regions, that they were more reliant on dairy. So I think you're more likely to have lactose tolerance in the body for people who are further from the equator, is the rough guess as a reason for that. Because the further you get from arable land, the more you have to rely on animal proteins and stuff just for energy intake. That's why you have like Inuits and stuff, people who live in the far north of North America. Their diet is very heavily based on seafood, just because that's the stuff that's around. You can't really grow potato crops in the Arctic Circle. It doesn't really do well even during the summer. It's kind of just ice all the time. But yeah, I can see how like their dietary preferences would reflect just how their bodies process foods. For me, I feel like slight lactose intolerance, where I don't get like violently ill or whatever from having dairy, but before I went vegan, the main meals that would make me feel like shit would be if I ate a whole pizza to myself over the course of a day or two. It would just be so much cheese that I could feel the inflammation in my body. Like my ankles would hurt, my knees would hurt, my lower back would be sore, that kind of a thing. But different people have different levels of lactose tolerance. Like some people can just slam milkshakes and milk stuff all the time and not really have as much of a negative reaction, whereas other people get really sick really fast, and a lot of that's genetic.
Huh. Well, that's as good as an explanation as you're going to get, because I don't have anything nearly that complex. So I would defer to you on that.
Yeah. Chad is asking, what are the agricultural goods that China produces? Are we talking about food for animals, or are there other factors that make their numbers that high?
Okay, so China produces a lot of rice, mostly in the south, a lot of wheat, mostly in the north. They produce a good amount of pork, probably some beef. I think pork is probably the bigger one, though. They grow a lot of soy. I don't know what specific region they would grow there, though. But they do make a lot of soy as well. Yeah, keep in mind that what China lacks in arable land and in terms of productivity, what they lack in terms of arable land and productivity, they make up for in terms of labor intensity. So, if you can't get the most modern equipment, you can still increase production by using more labor to more intensively cultivate the land that you have. And China has a lot of people. So they are able to make up, in part, the lack of land by more intensively cultivating broad swaths of their arable land,
That
what
makes
little
sense.
they may have.
Throw more people at the problem.
Yeah. So, that's how they've dealt with agriculture for, their entire history. They've always been major agricultural producers. They wouldn't have been able to grow so big if they hadn't been. The issue now is that they've just gotten so big that they've grown beyond their own means. But they're definitely still major producers.
Interesting. Yeah, chat's discussing a little bit what the ideal crops are for calories. Is the potato the best? Potato is so tasty. Mashed potatoes just make you feel like everything is going to be okay.
I would half agree with you. Because for me, potatoes are only palatable when they're with something else.
Interesting.
Mashed potatoes are fantastic, but mashed potatoes for me always came and come with either gravy or copious amounts of butter, as the case may be.
Oh, yeah, you're going to dress a potato. I'm not just talking naked potatoes here. For sure, for sure. It is a fairly straightforward root where it doesn't really have a ton of strong flavor on its own, but it has like a nice sturdy base of a lot of nutrients and stuff. So you obviously take care of that. Trisha and I were talking about making mashed potatoes with peas and corn in it.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of twice baked potatoes?
I've heard of it, but what is it again?
So basically, you scoop out the potato, and then you make mashed potatoes, and then you stick them back into the husk of the potato, and then you bake it again.
Oh.
It sounds weird, but my grandmother has sold me on it. It's pretty good.
Do you prefer fries or sweet potato fries?
Honestly, I kind of got to go with original fries on that one.
That's fair. How do you take your fries, with ketchup, mustard, or something else?
None of the above. I generally just eat them as is.
Salt?
If you want to make good French fries, in my humble, irrelevant opinion, you have to season them. That's how you make good French fries. So whether it's salt or maybe something else, it doesn't really matter. It just has to be something. For me, that's what I like in French fries. So some of the best French fries I've had are actually fries from Wingstop, and they heavily season their fries, and it's really good. I like the seasoning that they use. I like the way they bake them. It's well, not bake, but fry them. But yeah, they do a good job with theirs. Those are some of my favorites, and it's specifically because of the flavoring.
Honestly, chat's getting a little bit more uppity right now than they were during Israel-Palestine. This is a very sensitive topic. Please keep it together, chat. I know some of you are saying mayo goes on fries, and other people are saying, God, no, it doesn't. People are saying chili and shredded cheese, no ketchup. Some people are saying ketchup. Some people are saying poutine represent. I don't know if I've even had that. What is poutine?
Canada's national dish. It's basically just like chili fries almost.
Oh, gotcha, yeah. Immersion in Quebec. Gotcha.
Yeah, I actually had poutine for the first time when I was coming back to the U.S. from China. Because, of course, you fly through Vancouver, right?
Mm-hmm.
So while I was waiting for it was a layover, basically. And so while I was there, went out to the airport fast food area and got some authentic Canadian junk food in the form of poutine.
Nice. Dude, Vancouver has such good food.
Oh,
because
yeah.
it's such an international, diverse community there. Like, the Indian food there is insane. The Asian food there is insane. I remember, I think when you were staying with us there, we went to like a really, I would say you would call it a mid-tier Indian restaurant, but it was family owned and it felt really authentic and like really good quality stuff. So reasonable price point, but it was like a really good, authentic food experience there. So they've got good stuff.
Yeah, that was really good. I really enjoyed that trip.
Mm-hmm.
That was a lot of fun.
Yep.
Yeah.
That was paradise time, I think. That's a big part of why, if you get a work from home opportunity, chat, and then there's an increase for pay to go into an office, don't take it. Unless you want to be in the office. Your time is worth a lot. And also, requiring you to put on pants is worth a lot.
Yeah.
That was the top robe period for us, where if you work from home, everyone works from home. You wake up, put your robe on until you need to go to bed. Because you don't have to put on your suit and tie or whatever your business attire is.
Yeah, and he wanted to go to other places. I remember he was talking a lot about going to Bangkok back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that really sucks.
Mm-hmm. Wizard hat optional. He did have funny hats. The thing that was cool about Kukio that a lot of people might not have known was he had like a shitload of gadgets that did stuff. So he was kind of like a middle class Batman in that sense, where he didn't have billions of dollars worth of stuff where he could just roll out supercars and stuff. But any like utility knife, he had like fucking 80 utility knives. They each did something slightly different. Of like, if you needed to cut this particular type of knot, there's a utility knife that's actually best in class for that. So obviously he's going to need one of those, right? Because what if he runs into one of those knots? He's not going to be some schmuck who just has a regular knife. No, he's going to have the best knife. Why are we referring to him in the past tense? Because he passed away. God rest him, or whatever you believe in for that. But he was our patron, basically, for World Discussion with Agent Smith. Agent Smith and I know each other because we were mutual friends of him. And he was very generous with his time and his personal space, in the sense of he let different people like crash on his couch for long periods of time as they were between situations, giving them a place to live and sometimes like feeding them and stuff as well. So a really generous soul who saw people and saw their potential and wanted to do what he could to help them succeed. So thank you, Kukio, for giving us the longest running segment of this stream and also the stream as a whole. I remind people in chat to be grateful for people who have helped you in times of need. I know a lot of times when you achieve stuff, it feels very sexy to beat your chest and say, everyone look at me, I'm so good. But you did have to get a lot of help from other people. In every person's case, your parents took care of you to some extent, your education system gave you certain opportunities, all those different steps along the way. So he's definitely the number one originator of the stream as a whole, because he put his faith in me switching from poker to this. I used to be full-time poker. That was our original plan, was I'm going to go to Canada, set up the bank account, because I wanted to do stuff legally, right? So it's legal to play poker in Canada. You can open a bank account there. You can deposit money into like poker accounts. All of that was above water and fine, but we had to go to Canada for that. And I was thinking, like, as we moved back to the U.S., like, what if we just had a legal job now and I wasn't playing poker in the U.S.? Streaming could be cool, and there was a lot of an opening in the raging gamer niche, from what I saw, in terms of teaching people the value of a healthy mindset and being able to manage your tilt by focusing on the logic of how a match plays out rather than getting mad that you lost, per se. And we talked all the time about these kind of projects and stuff, and this was one where he basically really early on said, I believe in you, because he saw how I was progressing, moving up the ladder in StarCraft, and he felt like it was definitely a worthwhile conversation to have. So Neuro was born as a broadcast, so thanks all for being here for all this time. It's been almost 11 or 12 years, I think. I think I'm an 11-year Twitch partner, ballpark, which means I would have been streaming for about a couple years before then. By the way, the first couple years of streaming make pretty neatly $0. So that was all Kukio paying rent and everything. I was doing basically nothing to pull weight aside from paying for groceries. So that's a lot of faith to put in someone, and it means a lot.
Yeah. I still miss him.
Same. One thing that I was talking to Trisha about is I feel like he would really like Trisha for a lot of reasons. Like, she's very physically active and likes running around and doing stuff, and
oh my god, yeah,
he was definitely a fan of that. He liked when people would take initiatives and be athletic and do that kind of thing. He kind of would joke about different people in a social group, and like he would, in a loving, kind of teasing way, talk about who was or was not a tactical liability, meaning that if something happens, can they take care of themselves or do they need help? Figuring stuff out. Trisha's not a tactical liability. She's an asset because she run, jump fast, stuff like that. But yeah, I think the pursuit of good conversation was something that he really put at a high bar that I feel like is hard to come by in life. It's pretty hard to find someone who wants to talk with you and who genuinely wants to understand you, as opposed to someone who wants to talk to you to get more attention and approval. A lot of people enter conversations from that angle of, I want to exit this conversation feeling like I was smarter than everyone else and that I receive more approval and claps and attention than other people. And that's a very selfish stance to take, and a lot of people take that stance without even realizing that's the kind of set of plays that they're making. But Kukio definitely did, and one of the things that was so funny was watching him talk with someone like that who really wanted to be perceived as the smartest because he's so smart, like super, super sharp, and he's very patient, kind of like, I don't know, almost spidery in the way that he could handle a conversation with someone who is really uppity and like getting in his face about something. He would let them say all their bits, all their talking points, because he would think that it was funny. And he would be like, okay, let's see how far this goes. And it was refreshing because it wasn't like he was trying to talk over them. He would wait for them to say literally everything that they had to say for their whole argument and presentation. And then he would just start by asking questions about the stuff that didn't really seem very firm or logically sound. And over time, as they would explain to him these weak points in their argument, they would realize the weak points in their argument. And then they would realize that actually maybe there's some nuance to this. And then they would start feeling very smart that they had figured all this out themselves. And that's the Socratic method. So he taught me and people who knew him the Socratic method, where you don't need to throw back quips at someone and have like a quip battle of like, okay, well, the left is saying this right now, and on the right we say this back at that. It was more so really trying to wait until someone runs out of reasons and then letting them stand there on that precipice if I no longer have good reasons for why I hold this belief. And some people would have a light bulb moment. So Socratic method, very cool. You're debating with them rather than offensively and very directly, with a more finesse approach, kind of like how Mayweather I would say how Mayweather boxes, where for those who don't know, Mr. Mayweather, he's a very long-time champion boxer. He wins by dodging blows and not getting hit and waiting until his opponent gets exhausted. And they start to basically make mistakes that you can capitalize on. So normally people are going to lead in conversations with their wittiest, funniest, best quips first, and you wait until those expire. And then you try to get to more of the core of what defines you as an individual. What do you believe that's different from the main talking points of the current time? What defines your unique vantage point of maybe certain systems in the world that haven't been treating you well, and you have a unique story for that? Like, he would want to know those kind of things. And I feel like that energy is a huge part of what the world needs more of, is trying to win at arguments by really trying to understand the other person's perspective in a complete way where you could explain it to them and they would agree with you. A lot of people go into conversations and they don't actually care about understanding the other side's reasons because they know the other side is just wrong and they're wasting everyone's time, so they should just stop. It's a pretty hostile stance to take, but a lot of people do that because outrage media sells. It sells well.
Very much so.
But thank you, Kukio, for your amazing and based approach with Socratic method. Try it yourself sometime, chat. When there's an angry relative, instead of yelling back what the opposite side would say to that, really try to get them to intellectually test their own ideas and see if there are any weak points. It can be really funny.
Yeah, he's not around anymore, but I think you do have some videos with him.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was the Jedi stuff, wasn't it?
Oh, hell yes.
Yeah,
the Jedi video was amazing. That was one of the corniest, campiest things that's ever been made.
Yeah, so anybody interested in seeing Kukio can see him in one of those videos.
Yeah, I'm going to link it to you in Discord, because All you have to do is search YouTube for professional Jedi Shadow. And there's our video there. It was the first major production here at Neuro Related Industries. And some say it's still my best work. Other people have other opinions, but the way that he falls down is just so good. I'm just going to share it with the chat real quick for those who haven't seen this. This is Mr. Kukio. Alongside me, we're acting out characters from Star Wars The Old Republic. The Jedi Shadow is basically like a rogue class where it's a Jedi that uses stealth and assassination kind of moves. Here's the video.
Lay down your herbs.
Cast out your derps! Come and be a professional Jedi Shadow! Psst. Psst. Watch your back, noobs.
A classic. One of the great pioneer films of our time. We made those lightsabers ourselves. A lot of people, they don't know that. It was actually a stick, duct tape around the stick, spray paint the duct tape the color of your lightsaber. Write that down, that's the build. Do-it-yourself lightsabers. Also, the sound effects we did ourselves. A lot of people thought that we were pulling legit Star Wars lightsaber sound, but that was just improv. Yeah, it's pretty big.
That was for the days. I was back at the university, right?
No, that was before we left the first time, I think.
Oh, okay.
Wait. I'm trying to... Yeah, I think so. I think that was before we left, like right before. And then we leave, and then we come back, and we're in Carrollton the next time. This was in Las Colinas.
You guys were in Carrollton?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Carrollton's where we moved back to after...
Oh, wait, that was the H Mart place, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Dude, H Mart's so fucking good. Man, that whole plaza had so much stuff in it that was like very unique, non-chain restaurant. The boba place they had, and they had these weird like cookie things.
Yeah, it was hella fun.
Mm-hmm.
That Froyo place is the only Froyo place I've ever been that had the... what is it? They had like little bubbles, right? That you could put in there with like fruit flavored, so you had like strawberry and whatnot.
Yeah, they have jellies and stuff, yeah.
But then they also had a passion fruit one. I've never seen that anywhere else. It makes sense, in general, passion fruit is very popular in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And given that was the target demographic for that whole area, it makes sense. But I just thought it was really interesting and cool. I never wanted it. I never ate the passion fruit jelly. I don't particularly like the taste. But I thought it was cool that it was there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I always forgot that Carrollton goes up past George Bush.
Turnpike, yeah.
Threw me. Yeah. Because I grew up in the area, so I always just kind of assumed it was in my immediate vicinity where I lived. And then you guys would remind me basically, oh yeah, it's up there as well.
Mm-hmm. But yep,
yeah, Carrollton was fun. Irving was fun. You guys had some nice apartments over there.
Yeah, I think we initially landed in Irving for a bit, and then we pivoted to Carrollton because it was a more economical place.
Yeah, Irving is pretty expensive. For those of you who have not had the privilege of living in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, Irving is pretty much smack in the middle of the Metroplex, between Dallas and Fort Worth. It's not as close to the middle as Arlington is, but it's pretty close. And it's kind of an expensive area because it's close to the airport, the DFW airport. And so generally there's a lot of like business type people that live there. I think ExxonMobil's headquarters is there, isn't it?
Oh, it could be. I don't know.
Something like that. There's like a big oil company that has their global headquarters there. So it's a little bit pricey, but it's also really nice. I noticed whenever I would drive through, they had like nice things, not like where I lived. Going around where I lived, it was like shady people in vans and shit. And then I'd go over to Irving, and it's like 50 fucking people out bicycling, out on the side of the road. Very, very much middle class white people type activity going on there. Stuff I wasn't really used to growing up.
Lots
very
of
fancy.
Lots of yuppies in the Irving, Las Colinas kind of area. I went to orchestra practice there, so I actually was pretty familiar with Las Colinas whenever we lived there for a time. That little brick, it was basically a brick trail around that whole artificial lake in that apartment complex was so cool. Texas is very good at making artificial lakes. They have I think there's one real lake, and they just make so many lakes. And most of the time these lakes have soupy, dirty, gross water, but it's still a lake, and you can jump in it at your own risk. Take a shower after. Stay safe.
Yeah, I think the lake, there's only one natural lake in Texas, and it's actually shared with Louisiana, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not even fully a Texas lake. It's like on the border somewhere. So yeah, all of the lakes in Texas, other than that one, are actually artificial. Yeah, if you look at Google Maps, for those of you who enjoy geography, you can look at Dallas on Google Maps, and you'll see it's completely surrounded by lakes. And those are actually all reservoirs that were created to supply fresh water to the Metroplex, specifically Dallas. You generally have to drive either by them or through them, because there's a major highway that I think goes over one of them. Yeah, when I was driving to Oklahoma a year or two ago, I had to go over one of them. It's big enough that it kind of gives you the impression that you're traveling over a large body of water, even though it's kind of not. So it's a little jarring growing up in landlocked northern Texas.
Lake Louisville, Lake Grapevine, Lake Ray Hubbard. I can see all these big ass lakes all around the Metroplex. Yeah. Joe Pool.
Oh, Joe Pool. Yeah.
Mountain Creek
My mom
Lake.
used to take me there.
Yeah, I went to Lake Grapevine for hangouts. Usually, someone who has a boat, and they take you out into the brackish brown water. It's warm. The lakes are kind of nice in the sense of it's not too chilly of water to swim in, but it's not the cleanest because these aren't natural lake formations. It's kind of they dig a hole, there's dirt on the bottom, throw water in.
Yeah, it's pretty. The water's not great, as you say, but it's actually pretty nice. Generally, it's kind of relatively more well-off people who live out there, and generally they just go up there that kind of have fun. Yeah, they have cool 4th of July celebrations, like fireworks and stuff over the lake. It's pretty neat. Nice. My mother dated a guy for a while who had a boathouse up there, and it was really nice. It wasn't super expensive, but it was just working class, middle class recreation facility type nice. So it was pretty cool for me to be able to go out there. You grow up with a single mom, you don't see fancy shit of any kind, pretty much. So any kind of extra house that you own just for fun seemed impressive to me.
Yeah.
So those were always pretty fun trips. Also, we had cable.
Ooh, fancy.
Yeah. I was a kid in the 90s, so I was easy to impress. But yeah, having a boathouse and having cable, damn, dude, this guy must be a millionaire.
He's doing very well for himself. Yeah, North Texas. I remember it. Lived there for about 20 years of my life or so. Visited fairly recently, going to the Kiss concert in Austin. That was a pretty fun thing. I was really impressed because throughout the concert, the band kept checking in on me and seeing how I was doing. They were like, "How's it going, Austin?" And I was like, it's going pretty well. I wonder how much my dad paid for this ticket experience because they're really giving me a lot of attention. For those who don't know the joke, my first name is Austin. That's the joke. Got him. You work on Main Street at Grapevine? Yeah, Grapevine Mall is a Leviathan unto itself.
Oh, that's the big one?
Yep.
All right.
There's Grapevine Mall, and then there's the Galleria in Dallas, which is where I worked. And then there's also North Park, which is a smaller, overall slightly bougier than Galleria, but they're both very, very major shopping
Park's
centers.
more of like a suburban mall. Prototypical. Galleria is the fancy bitch mall.
That was a huge one, yeah. It used to be that the North Park had a few of more of the like chic niche clothing brands that weren't at Galleria, but yeah, it's I think changed probably over time a little bit.
Yeah, I ended up visiting all of them in a short period of time when I was trying to buy iPhones.
You
remember that?
Yes. Not just buying iPhones, it's like buying iPhones for the family overseas, right? Yeah, so it's like, how many of these can we get? And it's like, limit this many per customer. And they're like, fuck, we need to go somewhere else.
Yeah. It was quite the operation. Yeah, it was, man, I was there at like 4 a.m. in the morning, man. Very early. Huge ass lines. You had to get there early if you wanted to get past the lines. Otherwise, you're going to be waiting there for like 4 hours or some shit.
Yep.
Yeah, so I got to know the malls relatively well. Spent a lot of time there as a result. Yeah, the Galleria was definitely the nicest. Very fancy. It's like, what is it? It's got like 4 levels, right?
Yep.
And you can see, and they're all pretty much just stacked close to each other.
Yeah.
So I think they've even got like a big hole in the middle, so you can see all the way down to the ice rink at the bottom.
Ice rink, yes. Have done it. Very cool. Lots of different coffee options. Don't go to the Starbucks. Everyone goes to Starbucks. The line is fucking long. Go by Nordstrom. There's a coffee shop within the Nordstrom that's about the same taste as Starbucks with no line. So at least that was my wisdom when I was working. I worked at Armani Exchange and then Guess at the Galleria. So very familiar with that building.
Yeah, my sister has very similar work. Yeah, same experience pretty much.
It's cool. It's a feat of architecture. In Texas, people like building massive stuff. So that's definitely one of those things. Cool views. You can see lots of different shops and stuff. Just the building overall is pretty nice.
Did you ever go to Redbird Mall?
Redbird Mall?
Yeah.
I don't think
That was
so.
the mall we had down in Oak Cliff back in the day.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Is it nice or not nice?
It was not nice. Yeah, they ended up closing it. Not only because business was declining, Oak Cliff is not like a well-off area. It's kind of getting better it's been getting better the past 10 years, but especially back in the 90s, like, oof, that was like crack epidemic era. So that was the mall there was hard hit correspondingly, but there was also issues with like teenagers and violence and stuff.
Gotcha.
So, they did eventually end up shutting it down. Which most people were pretty happy about. A lot of people didn't like the mall, but I kind of liked it just for sentimental reasons. That's where I used to go a lot as a kid. Used to go to Walden's bookstore at Redbird Mall, get my Star Wars novels.
Nice. Star Wars. Man,
They were cranking them out back in the day.
Yep. Yeah, we have a nice musing on Texas wrap up to this world discussion. It was a place that lived for quite a while. Texas is an interesting state. I feel like it's got a culture unto its own compared to a lot of other states that are a little bit more maybe meek in their expression.
Yeah, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, speaking for North Texas, it's like you've got sort of somewhat southerny rednecks, a layer of rural rednecks underneath a layer of Yankees mostly and Californians that kind of came in to work as professionals like lawyers, doctors, work for the companies, lots of companies have headquarters in Dallas. So we have like a huge chunk of our workforce comprised as professions, bigger than in most other places. So it's, I mean, most cities tend to be kind of bourgeois, but Dallas especially tends to be pretty bourgeois. Like even within the Metroplex, there's a rivalry between Dallas and Fort Worth, because Fort Worth is like the cowboy conservative city, and then Dallas is like the super snobby Mercedes-Benz driving city full of assholes. So, even within the Metroplex, we kind of have that cultural distinction. But for North Texas writ large, like rural rednecks with a layer on top of them of like Yankee professionals, and then on top of them a huge influx of immigrants, not only from Mexico and Central America, but even from other parts of the world. A good chunk of the people that came over to the United States from Vietnam when the Vietnam War ended actually ended up in North Texas. So we've actually got like a whole section of Dallas, which is like the Asian area. And a lot of that is Vietnamese.
Yeah, there's a Saigon Mall that I've been to quite a few times. That place had a shitload of super good Vietnamese sandwiches, and there's a grocery store in there, and there's like a food court and stuff. Yep. Definitely. I think Vietnamese is the maybe biggest demographic in Texas after Mexican for minority demographics.
Probably Indian and Chinese would be bigger at this point. Because we've had a shit ton of students come over. You remember that at UT Dallas.
Yeah.
What was it, like half the university was either Indian or Chinese? Big influx because of the, what was it? It was either the business program or the engineering program. Like both of them together were the main draws for the university. And so lots of Chinese and Indian students are interested in those fields. And so a disproportionate chunk of the university correspondingly ended up from those two countries, which was great for me. I was fascinated by both, and I got to make a lot of friends from those places correspondingly, and learn a lot about them, which I might not have otherwise been able to do. But yeah, UT Dallas definitely has a very distinct feel to it, and it's very much one defined by nerds, engineers, and Chinese and Indians.
And everyone thinks that it's affiliated with UT Austin, so they say like "Go Longhorns" at you, and they're just like, "What are sports?"
Yeah, we didn't really have sports at UT Dallas. Well, I think the chess team was the most well-known.
Our chess team was the best. Yeah.
Yeah. We had an elite chess team what did they won like the national championships.
Yeah, they won
right?
nationals. Yep.
Yeah, they were really good. So they were more well-known than I think the basketball team.
Women's basketball team was our second most successful competitive entity.
Okay, that's what it was.
Yeah. And then the third most was our StarCraft club.
StarCraft club.
Yep, they actually did have one. We had like 25 members. It was pretty legit.
Did I ever tell you about the club that me and my friends tried to start when we were undergrads?
About what?
So I had a different circle of friends. Well, actually, it was the same one. Michael was part of it, and then also some other guys. I don't think you met them. I think you did meet them at the memorial we did at that bar. Yeah, so that was the group that was all together as undergrads at UT Dallas.
Oh, you guys played like vampire and stuff together, right?
They did. I don't think I was part of the role-playing stuff.
Gotcha.
I was in grad school.
Yeah, but I think I know that's the group of people, yeah.
Yeah, those are the guys. So when we were undergrads, one of us decided to start a club, and we decided it would just be a club to talk about history, which we all enjoyed doing anyway. And so we actually did all the paperwork and stuff, got it sorted out, and we ended up calling it History Science Theater 3000. And unfortunately, not a lot of interest. So pretty much every meeting was basically just us noting that there weren't any new people coming and then just going out to eat.
Yeah.
Whereupon we sort of unofficially changed the name of the club to the Officers' Dinner Party, since it was basically just all of the officers going out to eat.
That's a cool title, though. History Science Theater.
So.
Yeah.
We thought it might get more attention, especially once I started making propaganda posters. I found all these old Soviet propaganda posters, and I would just edit them in PowerPoint, print them out, and started putting them around campus.
Nice. Dude, printing stuff out and handing it to people, what a throwback. I remember printing out what Glass-Steagall and Citizens United were for people that occupy Dallas. That was good. I also printed out pamphlets, speaking of Dallas Galleria. The incentives program for our money exchange at the time, to me, seemed to heavily favor people who worked on weekends, and it wasn't actually incentivizing people who were good salespeople. So I made a big printout and I put it in everyone's locker. The management didn't like this. They said, you shouldn't have done that. And I said, well, people need to know. People need to know that it's rigged, and if you get the Saturday, Sunday shift and you get more of a payout, that doesn't mean you're a better salesperson. It means you were there when the foot traffic was the highest. Congratulations.
Yeah.
I was just grumpily sitting in there Tuesday morning, no one in there, and they're like, go fold the clothes. I just folded the clothes. There hasn't been anyone in here. And they're like, take out something and refold it. And I was like, I will end this with truth. So I will write these pamphlets and put them in the lockers and get my revenge. And I did. And there were like 2 other people who like agreed with me. And that's how I knew that I'd won. And I worked at Guess anyway instead. How we toppled an empire with papers. Remember, if you're going to start a revolution, you have to print out enough pamphlets. Because if you don't print out enough, then you don't get enough of a backing, and they shut down your operation and you lose. So,
Well, at this point, it might be easier just to have some bots spam the internet. It's basically the same thing.
yeah. Professional shit
robots to do it.
posters.
Well, let's see. I went way over time. I'm sorry.
That's okay. We were reminiscing, and that's valid. We need to do that some of the time. We shouldn't forget our roots. That's how people get lost and corrupted and turn evil. So chat, hold us accountable. If we don't stay true to our mission and our roots, and we become a zealous firebrand broadcast where we make you outraged and we start to go to bat for some political alignment, let us know, okay? Because we don't want to lose our way. We want to try to stay based and balanced and fair if we can, but not in that way. All the commentators here on Agent Smith, we promise you the level of aesthetic polish as Fox News broadcasters. Just kidding.
I don't have the editing chops. Well, I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 things here if we have time. So one, Colony of Ants did provide a clarification. Project 2025 refers to the Heritage Foundation's publication describing what a new potential second Trump term would entail, basically a plan for what the new Trump administration should do. So I did read about that. A lot of people were angsty about that because there was some aggressive plans in there, as far as using executive authority to pursue this, that, or the objective, and potentially bending the rules by doing so. Also, filling out a number of positions in the bureaucracy, that is to say, in the government civil service, with political appointees instead of with professional bureaucrats, which sounds like a good idea until you consider that political appointees are generally much less professional and much more loyalist in outlook, with corresponding damage done to the quality of governance and provision of public services. So, but at the same time, if you don't trust the bureaucrats, then it makes sense. So, whatever you like, just depends on your perspective. Regardless, I'm not worried about it because there was a very similar document produced by the Reagan administration back in the 80s, and it was pretty much the same thing. Definitely, I would prefer that the government and certainly the civil service be more professional rather than more political. But at the same time, elections have consequences, and mistrust being as high as it is probably inevitable. So not much to be done about it. It's not as though you won't have a chance to stop it in November. So we'll see how it goes. I think the bigger concern is not whether or not people can stop it, but whether or not people can reverse the damage that's eventually done if the Trump administration actually does go through with some of the more radical elements in that plan. But we'll see. That's just all part of the excitement in living in an era of uncertainty, action, and potentially the decline of liberal democracy in the West. Huzzah. Yeah, I would point out, too, that, filling out positions in the civil service with political appointees is not like something the Republican Party monopolizes. This is kind of something that everybody does when they're in office. They try to just get as many people that they see as favorable to their outlook into various offices as possible. It's been pretty difficult to do so over the past 20 years, given how much partisan rancor there is. But occasionally, when there has been unity of, the legislature and the executive, that is to say, when one party controls both the Congress and the executive, generally they do that. So Democrats did that when they had the opportunity during the Obama administration, as I recall. But they just didn't have much opportunity to do it 2 years later. When the midterm elections threw the House and the Senate back to the Republicans. Or maybe it was just the House. I don't remember exactly. But regardless, there's definitely some extreme stuff in there. But keep in mind, too, that it's not a coherent plan. It's not as though they had a bunch of master strategists sit down and try to concoct all of the best ways to undermine the Constitution. It was basically just a bunch of random dudes who were kind of relatively high profile within the Trump campaign, as well as just high-profile Trump supporters generally, and they basically just let them write stuff on whatever issue was the most important to them. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't that much coordination between them. You can see that in terms of how contradictory some of the stuff is. There were 2 trade guys who worked for the Trump administration who participated in the project and wrote 2 separate chapters in the document. And both of them basically had opposite things to say about what trade policy should look like under a new Trump administration. So, the document is incoherent. It's probably more flair and ambition more than actual plan. And it's not in keeping with anything that we've seen before in American politics, certainly during the Reagan administration or even during any given Democratic administration. So, yes, there's reason for concern, but it's the same reason for concern that we've had since Trump entered politics and has been successful. So there's no new concerns here, per se, I would argue. So the House is on fire, but it's not any more on fire than it was before. Let's put it like that.
Status quo.
Yeah. So that was one of the 2 things I wanted to get to. And the other thing is just that I've been playing a game called Old World, a strategy game, which I was looking forward to, but I wasn't sure if it would be good or if I would like it. But thus far, in my first playthrough, been having fun.
Nice.
So I'd be interested in other people's opinions on it, because I haven't played new strategy games in a long time. It's very, when it comes to strategy games, Stellaris and Civ have pretty much monopolized most of my strategy gaming sessions. So Old World is one of the first new ones, and it's sufficiently good that I wanted to bring it up, give it a little praise, and also ask for some feedback from some of the other strategy gamers that I know are listening or will eventually listen, since probably a lot of people have gone to bed by now.
Yeah, it's a 9 out of 10 review on Steam. May 18th, 2022 it came out. So relatively new. Cool.
Yeah, relatively new, but a lot of new interesting mechanics. It's very much a new take on the genre. And that's very much what the genre needed. It kind of been stagnating a little bit for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, normally when you play a 4X builder, it's very much focused on combat, expansion, economy, and maybe a few other mechanics that are thrown in. But with Old World, they throw in a whole bunch more. You've got a lot more resources to work with. You've got a lot more political mechanics. You've got basically a maximum of 3 noble families that will actually control your cities. You control production and whatnot, but the cities technically belong to them. And so depending on how you manage your relations with them, random events will change, and also production in the cities will change. That is to say, how much production happens in the city changes. And so there's lots of little mechanics like that in other areas as well. It's got a lot of interpersonal relationship embedded in it to a degree that I haven't seen before. And it's implemented pretty well, so I would recommend it.
Cool. It says it's similar to games I've played, because I played Total War Warhammer 2. So I guess it has some similar elements to that.
More Civ than Total War.
Gotcha.
Yeah, definitely more of that lineage, so to speak.
Nice. I've been playing a lot of Dota 2, StarCraft 2, and Baldur's Gate still. Those are kind of my big 3 since our guild retired. I heckin' wiped in the honor mode run in the Githyanki Crash I fell prey to the classic blunder of being too nice to entities that might soon become hostile. If you're trying to do a hardcore mode run through and you think that they might get hostile from a conversation, just fight them one at a time. I basically went past a hallway into a room where shit hit the fan and we fought, and then people filtered in through the doorway where I could have just pre-cleared the hallway, but I took mercy upon them and was killed for it.
Yeah, that'll do you. That'll do you in every time.
Yep.
I didn't even really think about pre-clearing hallways. I was just kind of killing people when I was playing, because I knew I was going to end up fighting, the bad guys, since I was doing, a good playthrough. And so rather than just kind of waiting for the combat to happen, I would preemptively start picking through people in sort of the enemy camps and whatnot of one sort or another. Yeah. So I accidentally made the game easier for myself.
Yeah. People don't ask as many questions when they're dead.
Very true.
Heavy-handed approach, but an approach nonetheless. Yeah, you probably play pretty different in Baldur's Gate versus in a Civ game, like a 4X.
Oh, yeah. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Civ is... You kind of have to be more cautious in Civ, because you never know who's going to just steamroll you. You don't know when the AI has just been building huge-ass armies and holding them in reserve waiting to pounce. Although that was more of a problem back in the day than the more recent entries. Yeah, Civ 5, Civ 6, combat is not really that much of an issue. You can probably win like the vast majority of conflicts. The most common criticism of Civ 5 and to a lesser degree Civ 6 is that the AI doesn't fight very well. So you're relatively safe in those games in terms of security. Civ 3, Civ 4, not the case.
They will hunt you down.
They will come at you. They will build giant stacks of doom with like 10, 20 units in them, while you've only been producing maybe like 5 to 10.
Wow.
And scattered around your empire, no less. So you got to scramble to try to shore up your defenses, and maybe you can fend them off in time.
Jeez.
Yeah. Those games were much more intense. You had to be on your toes, because the AI would gank you if you were not careful.
True. Well, stay safe, chat. If you play the old Civ games, expect to be attacked ferociously. This week, I will give you your usual weekly walk challenge and your push-up challenge and squat challenge. We actually walked, I think it was 15 miles over the course of the festival on Friday that we went to, the rave. So that was a lot of walking that you don't really think about because you're standing for a lot of it. But to get to all the different stages and walking from the parking past the nice Christians and the angry Christians and the moms and everybody, it was a good bit of exercise. So I give you that usual challenge. Appreciate your information as always, and also the reminiscing is welcome too. Chat, thank you for your contributions in the chat, and we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.